I just got my hair touched up. I made it gray because I just think like cooler tones look good on me. So,
Yeah, it's definitely not a coincidence that Kimmy just so happened to feel compelled to dye her hair within literally just a couple days after my last release. I don't understand the color choice at all, but that's been the case on multiple occasions in the past as well, where I could tell it was clearly intended to be somehow influential in my connection with her regardless. And within just a few days after my last release, I already see the exact same kind of extremely devious, underhanded, disrespectful, neglectful garbage that happened the last time people somehow worked up false narratives about me so badly behind the scenes in my absence to the point of attempting literally faking my death completely against my consent, wishes, and best interests, while I was also put into situations in real life where I had to survive multiple extremely brutal near-death experiences I was placed into completely unjustly. I can see this as extremely clear indication that there are extremely serious false narratives about me being persistently purported behind the scenes, which I can only imagine are pretty much certainly somehow working towards once again doing the exact same thing and attempting to manipulate, bully, and exhaust me into my silence coming off as somehow validating it, despite even everything I've addressed in the last 14 releases on this podcast. I'm going to once again reiterate that I am not and never have been and will never be at all consenting to this, nor legally or otherwise bound or obligated to allow this to happen. This is well beyond ridiculous now. The extreme severity of disrespect, neglect, and devious abuse being inflicted upon me by many entities at this point is so unbelievably immense that it seems I'm going to have to extremely meticulously absolutely tear to shreds, burn to ashes, and decimate the dust of every single even remotely plausible false narrative in relation to every piece of garbage I've had the extreme misfortune of being cursed to have ever even remotely been significantly close to ever in my entire lifetime. So it's so extremely painfully clear to every such extremely disrespectful, neglectful, abusive piece of garbage going to such extremely immense lengths to somehow misrepresent my life to the point they're blatantly attempting to fake my death fully consciously and intentionally against my consent, wishes, and best interests, that it's absolutely, unconditionally, absolutely impossible that they will ever succeed in this extremely abusive, morally bankrupt, literally illegal, relentless existential assault against me. Especially since it seems that there's rather extremely extensive intentional attempts to cause confusion, I'm going to start by extremely clearly stating that whenever I've mentioned or ever in the future mention the name Kimmy at any point in anything I release in this podcast, it is to be understood that I'm discussing or addressing the individual in real life that publicly goes by the legal name Kimmy Park and typically the online handle or nickname Angels Kimmy. Not Kimmy's role-playing character, September Foos, or any other alternative identities she may or may not possess in any context. If I ever intend to say anything regarding somehow relevancy of any other identity Kimmy might have, I would explicitly mention by name that I'm talking about Kimmy's character in a video game or some kind of role-playing or otherwise alternative context that I might talk about in that specific instance. This also applies to anyone else I ever mention at any point in time in this podcast. While my intuition strength means the situation I find myself in hasn't really gotten increasingly chaotic or confusing since my last release, it's rather extremely clearly apparent to me that my enemies have decided to go to utmost extremely great lengths to try especially hard to make my circumstances as emotionally dysregulating as they possibly can with their extremely malicious bad faith actor behavior. But I am far too real about everything I've been saying about my life and who I am, and far too meticulous about my attention to detail and how I deal with people in situations like this for this ridiculously pathetic attempt to manipulate or brainwash or destroy me to ever succeed. After further observing Kimmy's public behavior after my last release, I believe things have become more clear to me. It appears there's some extremely serious false narrative present regarding the influence of ASMR in my life. This appears to have some extremely strange direct relevancy to an extremely serious false narrative in relation to my position on pregnancy and children, or perhaps the direct relevancy is in relation to my sexual desires, and then that narrative warping has been extended into a natural progression towards the topic of pregnancy and children. These things have been getting extremely deviously, viciously, relentlessly abused to attempt to endlessly facilitate various further extremely false narratives across various topics being constantly warped about who I am and how I'm feeling and what I'm doing over time. And this extremely malicious, abusive, manipulative behavior being inflicted upon me as what is ultimately an extremely seriously brutal, relentless, existential assault, effectively waging a war to the literal death in real life against me, has been extremely viciously, relentlessly abused to take advantage of my reactions to it in the past, to misrepresent them as if to be evidence of me being depressed, fake, a bad person, or somehow toxic, or mentally ill, or unstable, or simply really dumb and emotionally inept. It's absolutely genuinely the case that I'm not, never have been, and never will be appeased or forced to shut up or willing to tolerate any kind of notion of being at all incentivized ever to even slightly reconsider my position in regards to this conflict or somehow compromise my integrity to any extent about anything because of Kimmy's ASMR. Also, that I'm not, never have been, and will make absolutely certain I never will be indebted to Kimmy for her ASMR in any way, shape, or form. But not just Kimmy. The same is, always has been, and I'll make absolutely certain always will be, also just as true for anyone else that does, ever has, and ever might create any kind of ASMR content to any extent. In fact, beyond that, I find it pertinent at this point to extremely clearly, explicitly, officially state that I do not, never have, and am quite certain never will, at all particularly care for, or even remotely regularly consume ASMR of any kind. The only even remotely possible exception situation that could change that at all is that I might start being able to enjoy Kimmy's ASMR if I get the proper kind of private and public relationship with her that I want and deserve in a timely manner before it's seriously too late for that to even be at all realistically possible, and therefore I'd perhaps possibly actually be able to appreciate it as soothing instead of having to anxiously be stressing while listening to it as I'm trying to see if there are any hints of false narratives about my life she might be deviously trying to slip past my awareness through it. The more I reflect back on some exceptionally strange behavior I've witnessed from Kimmy in relation to ASMR, the more deeply concerned and disturbed I become that there's seriously been extreme misrepresentation of the influence of ASMR, especially Kimmy's ASMR, in my life. She's been extremely devious about how she addressed the influence of ASMR on her own life, largely acting like the extent and manner in which she interacted with it and making content she'd at various degrees or times classify as ASMR, to the point where I certainly felt it was rather strange how excessive and obsessed she was coming off with things like having entire streams casually whispering the whole time while she was doing otherwise typical streaming activities, was something she did so extensively because she herself personally enjoyed it a lot. Whether or not it's true that she genuinely enjoys ASMR as much as she claims, I want to make sure it's extremely clear that had I known there was any even slight notion that Kimmy's or anyone else's ASMR was supposedly something I was requesting or requiring, as if to be somehow indebted to anyone at all for it, I would have put much more effort much earlier on to make sure it's extremely clear that such is not, never has been, and never will be the case. I don't find ASMR disgusting or unpleasant in general, but I also don't have any fixation or dependence on it at all either. If I really need to relax or ground myself, I can do a plethora of things to attempt to achieve that effect. Meditation, sleeping, eating, just doing something different for a little while than what I'm doing in that moment. I'm not going to list it all out. ASMR typically doesn't really have a place in my day-to-day life. I'm usually either engaging directly with something that has some kind of audio I need to pay attention to, in which case I give that audio my complete focus as far as listening to anything goes, or I'm listening to music to keep me energized and inspired, or I'll just let my ears rest in silence. Beyond that, there appears to also be an extremely serious false narrative about me relating to the influence of people changing their hair, especially by dyeing it different colors. I'm not sure exactly how this relates to the ASMR-related false narratives I just mentioned, but there's one especially extremely severely toxic, manipulative, narcissist psychopath I've had the extreme misfortune and displeasure of encountering in my life that I know for certain has extremely heavily abused the supposed influence on my life of them dyeing their hair certain colors in order to fully consciously and intentionally perpetuate extremely false narratives about me that work entirely at my expense against my consent, wishes, and best interests. I'm talking about an extremely toxic nobody loser named Chloe, who I once upon a time went to high school with over 10 years ago. I've mentioned her before on this podcast in the release called Out in the Cold. I know she's lied about our connection massively to others behind my back, and it's to the point she's literally even blatantly lied in statements she's given to the police that I've seen transcripts of in court documents when I requested access to my disclosure during dealing with criminal charges over the hellish nightmare she's put me through. So I should explain the story behind how she's been extremely brutally, relentlessly tormenting my life for the past over a decade with her extreme lies and devious abusive attitudes and behavior towards me. When I went to high school, I was arguably the most popular kid in the school. I'm talking like people I'd never seen or even heard of before would randomly want to high-five me in the hallways and thank me for hacking the school's Wi-Fi password and leaking it to the entire school's student population for free. I was part of many friend groups, one of which had two people who were really good friends named Jerry and Herman. Around the beginning of second semester in grade 9, this girl named Chloe started obsessively pursuing dating Jerry, and rather quickly basically forced her way into that friend group through that. From the beginning, Jerry acted like he rather blatantly clearly wasn't really interested at all in ever actually dating Chloe. He was just okay with having a female hanging around him because that wasn't a typical thing for a guy like him, being someone with a personality and social standing far different from mine. Chloe seemed so obsessed with him that she was either blind to his blatant leading-on behavior or simply didn't care and was too eager to even simply be around him to have the self-respect to look for someone else to pursue who would actually even remotely seriously reciprocate feelings for her. I didn't even really check Chloe out in the very beginning out of respect for Jerry, but as I saw he wasn't serious about her at all, I actually took a good look at her and realized I found her to be by far the most physically attractive girl in the whole school. She was so much more physically attractive to me than anyone else that even though multiple girls showed interest in me throughout high school, I never felt even remotely interested in dating or even really beginning any kind of attempts to pursue any kind of romantic connection with any of them. And it wasn't because they were objectively ugly or even particularly unappealing to my tastes. At the same time, even years after she'd started chasing him, Chloe still obsessed over Jerry and stayed in this awkward spot where I felt I couldn't even really show her how I felt about her out of respect for Jerry. Towards the end of grade 12, Chloe finally got so fed up with Jerry just messing around with her that I guess she figured it was the smart thing to do to start pursuing Herman, which I figure she did out of spite and convenience more than anything, since Herman was Jerry's best friend. She dated Herman for, literally just a month before he broke up with her. Herman very clearly found Chloe's body, being bigger boned, rather unideal, with him making it clear he greatly prefers shorter and overall petite girls. He made this so clear that even though I wasn't really very close with him at all, and actually hardly ever spoke to him because I didn't have much reason or desire to, I learned this directly through his own public behavior at school. After Herman broke up with Chloe, I felt Chloe should have finally seen rather extremely painfully clearly that neither Jerry nor Herman are really into her, meaning I wasn't really disrespecting either of them if I finally took the opportunity to try to express how I really feel about Chloe to her. But there was a problem. For many months already, I'd been very clearly, fully consciously and intentionally making it a point to be completely ignoring Chloe and refusing to speak even a word to her ever. Despite being within close physical proximity around her very often due to the friend group with Jerry and Herman being the friend group I hung out with the most. Throughout high school, I always tried to be a positive and pleasant person to be around to everyone. In reality, deep inside, I was deeply depressed and always extremely anxious and felt really alone. My home life was a perpetual hellish nightmare every moment, with my biological mother's extremely toxic and abusive attitude and behavior towards me. She'd constantly start raging, yelling fights with me over things that never went anywhere by the time she stormed away and weren't even anything I could have plausibly had control over half the time. She always deviously tried to make me feel extremely pathetic and inadequate and like I'm a horrible person, even when I was extremely humble, mature, well-behaved, and hardworking, especially for my age. I never really felt safe or comfortable at all when I was at my biological mother's house. I didn't want to feel like a burden to anyone at school with my issues and open up to anyone, and nobody ever really made me feel like they cared about me at school either. But I figured that at least I could try to make my school environment somewhere I could feel a bit safe and comfortable and try to feel at least a little loved, since I certainly never felt even remotely at all loved by any of my blood relatives. So I was so friendly to other students that I'd even sometimes just go around lightheartedly telling people I was even simply on decent acquaintance terms with the words, "I love you." Most people would just smile or laugh a bit, and it was chill, because they knew I was just trying to spread good vibes. Some people would unsurprisingly take it kinda weird and say things like, "Me too, but just as friends," or "I don't swing that way," thinking I was hitting on them or something, and I'd respectfully clarify my intent, and then they were cool with it. I never felt like anyone really took it the wrong way or had an issue with me. Except Chloe. The first time I said it to her, she straight up looked into my eyes, laughed, and literally said the exact words, "I hate you." Nothing else. No just kidding, no explanation, no even somehow hinting at why she said it or any kind of alternative interpretation. Multiple other people present to witness it. Just, "I hate you," and then casually continues going on about her day like she didn't just seriously antagonize someone that was constantly around her only real friend group she was a part of and supposedly one of her friends. It hurt me, but I figured maybe she was just in a bad mood that day, or maybe she was trying to tell me she's into me but just wanted some time to process how she could maybe try to express it to me. I gave it time and tried pretending it never happened. I wasn't sure how else to handle it, since I didn't feel it was appropriate to start a fight with her or some kind of conflict within our mutual friend group over it. Months later, nothing had changed, and I was feeling increasingly hurt and confused by Chloe's attitude and behavior towards me. I never tried to be too cold or too warm to her, but for someone that was supposedly a friend, her attitude was extremely weird and strangely shady towards me. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I knew it wasn't jealousy or bitterness or some kind of toxicity from my end. I thought maybe I was just overanalyzing things and hurt by that one instance of her behavior, because she was so physically attractive to me that it obviously bothered me that the person I found by far the most physically attractive in the school, that was supposed to be my friend, was strangely just blatantly hateful towards me. The entire time I was in high school, I never told anyone I found Chloe so physically attractive or really showed it in any way. I was always a very respectful person to everyone and completely stayed away from ever gossiping about anyone or involving myself in any kind of drama or behavior that was likely to lead to drama. So it would have been obvious that whether or not I felt attraction to her, a lack of me showing any attraction to her should have been understood as respect for her very visible, blatant pursuit of Jerry. So one day, I tried lightheartedly telling her the words again, like I would have to anyone else I said them to. Same exact response. Looks into my eyes, laughs, and just says, "I hate you," and then goes on about her day like nothing happened. She wasn't kidding. She seriously didn't even give any explanation or hints as to why she hated me. I felt like I was going crazy. I'd said these words to several other students I was of varying degrees of friendly with, both male and female, and none of them had ever reacted this way. None of them ever even lightheartedly joked, saying the words, "I hate you." Some even rather warmly said the words, "I love you," right back to me with a smile on their face. I was even more hurt by Chloe's attitude and behavior, but didn't want to cause conflict, so I just silently suppressed my feelings. Months more passed. I didn't think that much of Chloe's behavior, but when I did, it increasingly hurt. My home life was already so extremely miserable constantly, and Chloe was starting to make me feel this really weird tension in my school environment among my main friend group. The fact that I found her to be by far the most physically attractive female in the entire school only made things worse. I figured she probably didn't think I felt the way I did about her, but her behavior was extremely strange regardless. I really didn't want to start a conflict, but I really needed some kind of explanation for the sake of my sanity. I figured trying a third time had to result in some kind of different response. So since it had been quite a while and I knew it shouldn't come off obsessed or creepy or disrespectful, I said the words to her a third time. Exact same response. That was just too much for me. I played it off really cool and initially pretended nothing happened, just like every other time. But I was shook. How can someone be like that? It's just too strange, and I felt it deeply even back then. Something about the situation just felt so wrong to me. I felt genuinely hated by Chloe. So I made a decision. She hates me? Okay, then she must not want me to ever say anything to her. It must have been annoying to her that I was even around her because I talked to my other friends in that friend group. But I wasn't going to just stop being friends with them all just because of her being toxic. So I decided I'll just make the conscious decision to stop speaking to her, since that's what someone that actually hates me would want me to do. I decided those words would be the last words I spoke to her. She tried to talk to me later that day, but I completely ignored her. I walked away. She called out for me and tried speaking to me again, but I just kept walking. I made it a point to make it clear I was intentionally ignoring her. The next day, she pretended to be bothered and care when she talked to Jerry and Herman, but she clearly didn't. Even very trivially reflecting on the last words I'd said to her before starting to ignore her would make it abundantly clear that it was because of her responding to a light-hearted, warm "I love you" between friends with purely good intentions by seriously making a mockery of me and laughing at my kindness and straight up saying the words "I hate you" to my face and then going on about her life like that's an appropriate response 3 times in a row over several months, demonstrating a consistent, persistent, genuinely hateful attitude towards me. If she actually cared even in the slightest, she would have came to me, apologized for being mean and coming off like she genuinely hates me, and asked if we could be friends again. Or more, if she wanted that. And I definitely would have dated her if she asked me out. But instead, she was clearly in reality all too happy to have me ignoring her. I'd already been ignoring her for many months by the time she broke up with Herman late in grade 12. Even though I knew that the situation felt rather clearly like Chloe was entirely the one at fault, my biological mother's extremely severe constant abuse put my mental health in a volatile state back in high school, so I somehow felt worried maybe it was my fault. My biological mother is actually a complete psychopath that was constantly bullying and insulting me and yelled at me near daily for no good reason. She used me as an emotional punching bag like it was the only thing I'd ever be good for, and massively lied about the truth to her family and anyone else that would listen. So I was an extremely neurotic mess inside back then, because I still hadn't even escaped the active, direct inflicting the trauma my biological mother was inflicting daily upon me, much less had time to process it fully and heal from it. I've mentioned before that I prefer Korean women, and Chloe isn't Korean, so let me make sure I've left no room for doubt about this right now. My high school had a population of students that were literally like over 90% Chinese. Now, that's perfectly fine with me. I have nothing inherently against Chinese people, and actually tend to find Chinese women more physically attractive than women of most other ethnicities. But I always knew I tend to find Korean women significantly more attractive than women of all other ethnicities, and there was literally only one Korean girl in my grade in the entire school. While that one Korean girl in my grade was actually very physically attractive to me, and so much so that I actually ultimately ended up asking her to prom among all the people I could have asked, and she accepted. That girl was no Kimmy, okay? I might greatly prefer Korean girls, but that doesn't suddenly make me racist and of the mentality that any Korean girl is just by default infinitely preferable to me than anyone else that isn't Korean, no matter how the person looks or what kind of connection we share. We had no mutual friends or shared interests. The only other Korean girl in the entire school was that girl's younger sister, who was in a similar situation. By the time Chloe broke up with Herman, I knew she was easily by far the most physically attractive non-Korean female I'd ever seen and can ever imagine existing, based on my tastes. Plus, there was this really weird sexual tension I felt in the dynamic she'd left me in with her behavior, and it at least gave me something to work with versus the one Korean girl in my grade who had no mutual friends with me and never really spoke to me or clearly shared any common interests with me or anything. I felt obsessed and like I'd lose my mind if I didn't at least make sure Chloe knew how I felt and that I at least got a clear rejection if she really didn't like me. I didn't even know why she hated me so much. I thought to myself that maybe she just feels like there's no way I'd be into her, so maybe she secretly really likes me, but she's just too insecure to show me. Regardless, I knew I had to make sure I didn't live the rest of my life regretting never trying to ask her out. One day, after trying to gather the courage for weeks prior, I decided to approach Chloe respectfully and ask her if we could talk alone for a moment. She seemed a bit surprised, but very quickly agreed. We went to a quiet spot in the school without a bunch of people walking past, and she looked at me in understandable curiosity as to why I wanted to speak to her alone. I was really nervous, so I started giggling briefly initially. I wasn't sure how else to deal with the stress. Chloe remained appearing confused. I really felt it would have been too weird and pretty much certain to fail miserably for me to just be like, "Hey, I like you. You want a date?" Or something. So I wanted to go for an approach that'd actually be what I felt was much more convincing. After calming down a bit and composing myself, I managed to get out the words, "Can I squeeze your ass?" Now, would I do the same thing normally? Of course not. Normally, women don't treat you the way Chloe treated me. I'd say that in the vast majority of cases, this kind of thing would obviously be considerably creepy to do. But how strangely, intensely, antagonistically Chloe had treated me didn't leave me feeling like any kind of normal approach to the situation would really achieve anything except maybe leave her feeling like I actually just wanted to repair our friendship, which neither Chloe nor anyone or anything else had ever even remotely given me anything I'd consider good or adequate reason to want to fix or maintain when she was the one who never really treated me properly to begin with, and I didn't have any ulterior motives. so I knew I had to do something unusual for enduring the stress of interacting with her to even be worthwhile for me, and I figured Chloe would react one of two ways. Either be visibly creeped out and give me a dirty look or something and basically say no one way or another and leave, in which case I'd just have to accept the rejection and that she was just a really toxic person, or maybe, as unlikely as it was, she'd be pleasantly surprised and figure, why not, and let me touch her butt. And then I could have done it and told her it felt really good and that I've in reality wanted to date her for a long time and was wondering if it felt good for her too and if she'd like to give dating me a try, since clearly Jerry and Herman didn't want her and I couldn't see anyone else pursuing her or being pursued by her at the time. But instead of either of those kinds of reactions that any even remotely decent human being in those circumstances would have had, she smiled a huge smile, started giggling, and asked me why, as she continued giggling some more and smiling with a look in her eyes like she was aroused and flirting with me quite seriously. I was shook. I'd mentally prepared myself for either of what I considered the only realistically possible scenarios of how she'd react. Not to something like that. I replied seriously with, because I think it's really nice and I'd really like to touch it. I mean, how many reasons can someone have to straight up ask to touch your butt in a one-to-one conversation while clearly not being just friendly? But I wasn't going to get angry at her when she was being so flirty and looked really turned on to know I obviously found her extremely physically attractive. Like, given the situation, it must have all of a sudden become obvious to her that I'd completely silently touched myself to her many times in the past already at that point. It just had to be. It was obviously extremely clear to her that nobody does what I was doing there just for fun or for some weird ulterior motive. But instead of seeming creeped out, she seemed flattered and turned on. So I figured just admitting how I felt was clearly what she wanted to hear, and she'd already decided on communicating to me that she wanted me to touch her butt, or at least that she was interested in pursuing dating me and eventually taking it there and likely ultimately further as well. She still had a huge smile on her face, and she giggled some more before simply saying no. I started feeling hurt and upset. What kind of situation is that? If you really don't like me, show me you're creeped out to know I'm so turned on by your body and distance yourself from me so I know I'd be a creep to pursue you any further and I should just stay away and keep my feelings to myself. Don't tease me massively and lead me on massively and then send extremely mixed signals and put me in some extremely difficult spot where it's like you're trying to set me up to make it seem like I'm secretly attracted to men or I'm passive aggressively or somehow deviously being mean to you and trying to make you feel ugly or something if I don't just reach for your butt and feel it up despite your explicit verbal non-consent. Which then obviously presents its own problem because it's concerning for someone to want to put you in such a shady position, even if they'd be warmly receptive to you feeling them up in such circumstances. Even worse, she didn't display any visible discomfort and start leaving after saying no. She remained standing there, looking me in the eyes all flirty and seductive, smile on her face and giggling. I figured maybe she just didn't want to feel or come off like she's trashy by explicitly saying yes to having her butt felt up by someone she wasn't dating, so it seemed her behavior was intended to indicate to me that she wants physical intimacy with me, but she wants me to approach it a bit more gently or sensitively. Can I have a hug then? Was what I decided on saying next. I mean, I imagined she could tell her behavior was so obviously flirty that she was coming off like she's at the very least inviting me to show if I'm serious about wanting to touch her intimately, so then maybe I could do something like hug her and reach for her butt while we're hugging, and maybe she felt it'd be less awkward than just turning around and telling me to go ahead or something like that. A mere no came out of her mouth again. She wasn't giggling so much anymore, but she still had a very clear smile on her face. It was definitely very obvious to both of us that it wasn't a merely friendly conversation, and it was definitely obvious to her that I extremely seriously wanted physical sexual intimacy with her, and she was expressing considerable comfort and desire for reciprocation by remaining so open to the interaction continuing how she was allowing it to. I was really feeling confused and hurt at that point. I was left feeling like I should accept she might just not be ready for physical intimacy right away, but maybe she wanted to just talk a bit about how upsetting her failed attempts with Jerry and Herman were before agreeing to start dating me. Then maybe she'd end up consenting to at least light physical intimacy not very long afterwards and escalate gradually as we both felt comfortable from there. If she was just worried I wanted to feel her up once and then ditch her and not date her, I was plenty willing to be patient enough to prove that wasn't the case. So I was like, okay, is this the first time someone's asked? Because at that point I was genuinely curious to know, and I needed some way to gently ease into conversation about her experiences with Jerry and Herman to get a better feel for what was even going on at that point. Yes, she said. In a way, I was really surprised, and at the same time, in a way I wasn't. I obviously had to ask. Herman didn't ask? He hasn't touched it? No, she said, as she looked away. Her smile was suddenly gone. She actually seemed hurt that he hadn't shown more interest in her body, but it's certainly rather strange to be trying to get at someone that I'm not really close to by being strangely extremely flirty in response to me obviously being really into her. So I saw it much more as her trying to show unhappiness with her connection with him because she wanted me to feel convinced she wanted me to ask her out, rather than some weird thing where she thought she could somehow force me to put effort into strengthening their connection at my own expense for what she obviously knew was effectively zero real benefit anyone had to offer me for doing so. Again, there was never any kind of appeal or incentive I had to interact with Chloe like this unless I seriously wanted to date her. It's not like I was expecting her to just let me feel her up once and then pretend it never happened, and I was plenty willing to prove it to her. So I said, wow, well, I guess he's really not that into you, but I am. Do you want to date? It seemed reasonable and respectful enough to me. I still don't feel like I was being creepy given all the factors surrounding the situation. If anything, she was being extremely creepy if she was being that receptive to this whole thing and had some kind of ulterior motive. No, I'm only into Asians, was what she said. No confusion, as if she thought someone else would have told me or something. No even remotely visible feelings of guilt or any kind of displeasure at telling me this information she clearly could tell was new information to me. She even suddenly had a big smile on her face again and was giggling a little after. It was like she genuinely enjoyed knowing she was obviously hurting my feelings quite badly with what she'd just said. This girl actually led me on to the point of enduring that much discomfort and confusion to reach the point I asked her out, and it felt more right than I could ever imagine asking someone out feeling right to me, only to then drop blatant hardcore racism on me. It wasn't specifically any part of my looks or my attitude or anyone I was friends with or anything I could change. She just felt like tormenting me with leading me on all the way up to being faced with her blatantly being a massive racist. Just when I thought she couldn't possibly hurt me anymore, I was suddenly plunged into a whole new level of hurt. Like, yes, I personally, in all honesty, would only ever even seriously consider dating Asians, and for the most part, specifically only Koreans, because I know very well what I'm looking for in a partner, physically and mentally, and I'm not going to be indecisive or shallow about it to anyone. But if some non-Asian person actually directly communicates with me very clearly and hits on me or asks me out somehow, I'm not going to reject them by trying to extremely brutally humiliate them and make them feel gross and inadequate for not being born Asian. I'd just respectfully, politely somehow communicate to them the general notion that I'm not interested and I don't feel desire to explain myself or mess around. Straightforward and clearly serious, but also considerate and respectful. And then I'd leave them alone and make sure they don't feel led on or like I'm sending them any kind of mixed signals. I've had people show interest in me who I've treated this way before, and I've never had any real problems. Even if I quite dislike the person for whatever reason and wonder why they'd even bother asking because they should know I'd reject them without question, depending on the nature of the connection, I might very seriously briefly inquire as to why they're asking while showing very clear visible discomfort that they did. But it'd be very obvious I'm not flirting at all. I'd imagine this is common sense. Even if I feel like giving them a really dirty look and calling them a massive creep as I walk away is excessive, I'd make it very clear right away that I'm rejecting them. I'm certainly not going to extremely cruelly, massively flirt with someone and lead them on in an extremely intense, clearly heavily sexual interaction regardless. Not now and not back then. I was an anxious mess back then, but never an extremely cruel, shady piece of garbage, and certainly not one with extremely racist inclinations on top. But clearly, I'd extremely severely misjudged Chloe's personality when I'd ever thought she was an even remotely decent person. I was so shocked at the whole situation that I was just silent. I wasn't sure what to even say. I was extremely angry and hurt. And even more than that, my mind was already racing about why she might do this kind of thing beyond just being an extremely sadistic piece of garbage that simply enjoys hurting people. My immediate worry became a lack of more clearly expressed interest from me, leaving her feeling justified in extremely seriously believing I'm secretly attracted to men and wanted her to try to push me to reveal such a thing. I was still processing how I could even deal with the situation so she wouldn't leave it trying to act like she thought that's what I always wanted. But it was the anything else that she said after a few moments of silently looking into my eyes with a big smile on her face that really convinced me of what I had to do. If she reacted poorly, she actually obviously intentionally put me in a situation where she tried to just massively abuse my genuine feelings for her to try to justify twisting the interaction to make me seem like a horrible person. There were no witnesses. She'd already acted so disturbingly that the only thing that even made sense anymore for me, since she was still comfortable sticking around seemingly just to give me time to feel like she wants me to just go for it and grab her butt without caring about her lack of verbal consent, was to say no. What's really crazy is how she just said, okay, and then just stood there with a big smile on her face, looking at me like, what are you gonna do now? Like she knew she was intentionally being as screwed up as she could possibly be to me and trying to inflict as extremely severe mental illness as she could with the extremely intense emotional dysregulation and trauma she was clearly fully consciously and intentionally causing me. With me now able to see it extremely clearly for what it really was, this was extremely unhinged, exceedingly narcissistic behavior from her. She just kept standing there like she wanted me to understand there was some particular reason she was waiting for me to open the door for her to leave the staircase area we were in. So I did. And as she slowly walked towards me, looking me in the eyes with a big smile still on her face, and went through the door I was holding open for her, she looked over her shoulder at me right as she was passing through the door, as if to express to me that she was interested in catching me staring at her butt because she knew I'd be thinking about reaching for it, and she knew that and wanted me to. At that point, I'd say it's absolutely ridiculous for her to claim she wasn't acting like she wanted and expected it. The only alternative explanation was that she's such a narcissistic psychopath that she was getting extremely disgusting sadistic pleasure thinking of how tormented and disturbed she must have known I felt by how she'd just treated me, and she was trying to catch me staring at her butt because she was already thinking about how she was going to try to manipulate me into allowing her to paint me as a massive creep to everyone else by massively misrepresenting the encounter. What was she expecting? Blatantly, thoroughly, verbally rejecting me with absolutely disqualifying blatant racism after acting blatantly extremely hateful and antagonistic towards me to the point I felt compelled to make it a point to outright ignore her for many months, and suddenly I'm forced to pretend we're on good terms and mess around with letting her watch me stare at her body sexually and try to creepily compliment her on it? I never wanted or needed that mind game garbage in my life, so I went ahead and reached for her butt while she was watching, hoping for the best. But she suddenly violently jerked her whole body away the moment my hand touched her. Like, no exaggeration, my hand didn't even make contact with her butt for even one whole second. It was milliseconds before she aggressively flung her whole body away from me so violently she slammed into some nearby lockers against the wall, as if I'd just violated her really badly and I should feel horrible about myself for being a decent, sincere person towards her that genuinely didn't assume the absolute worst in her even a moment too soon. And in doing so, she thoroughly proved the absolute worst to actually be the truth all along. At that point, I was just straight up extremely deeply traumatized by the whole experience. It was beyond the point of confusion. I refused to believe anyone would ever act the way Chloe had just acted and not be doing so with extremely serious mental illness and intentional malice. But she didn't scream or run away. Looking back at it now, she must have been calculating everything, and it must have been because she knew there were cameras in the school. If she tried giving an even slightly different recollection of events in my presence in a direct confrontation type scenario, and it came to pressing the school administration for camera records, they'd prove my recollection of events was the truth, and not her narcissistic delusion that she probably to this day claims makes me the predatory psycho in that situation. She wanted to intentionally leave me feeling extremely hurt and confused and guilty about the whole thing and not speaking the truth so she could lie about it however she wanted behind my back to benefit herself at my expense. I was so shaken by her pulling away from my touch, and especially as aggressively as she did, that I wasn't going to just leave her alone after she'd acted how she just had. She didn't even tell me to leave her alone either. We silently walked together to the cafeteria and sat down facing each other. She ranted to me about how miserable she was at home and how upset she was that her parents gave her little brother so much freedom to go outside often, but she was stuck constantly in the house because she's a girl and that was what her parents decided was appropriate accordingly. She was very strangely much more talkative to me in that moment than she's ever been, even to this day. I was tempted to stare at her breasts while she talked, since I've never found that part of her body at all lacking either. But I wanted to try to show her very clearly that I was thoroughly unwilling to be baited into looking like a creep in front of others and allowing her to warp the narrative of the reality of how she'd just treated me. So I kept my eyes looking right into hers. That's right. This girl really had the audacity to massively lead me on, traumatize me, and then trauma dump on me and try to manipulate me into looking like a massive creep in front of others so she could try to justify how badly she's always treated me from the very beginning of our knowing each other. And she acts like I'm the bad person. And how I know that she's been lying massively to others about what really happened and trying to ruin my life with her lies that make her look like the victim in the situation is that I've seen police transcripts where she made a statement and apparently claimed that I know that information because my ex-friend told me. No, that's a complete lie and she knows it. Nobody else ever told me Chloe's home life struggles. Even as much as me and Jerry would hang out and talk about video games and tech stuff all those years ago, he'd never talk to me about Chloe in general, in any way, much less elaborate on her personal struggles with her family. And neither did anyone else. Actually, when I really think about it now, I even see reason to believe Jerry has been significantly involved in slandering me as well, at least at some point in time. There was one case where, shortly after I started ignoring Chloe in high school, Jerry for some reason felt compelled to try to ask me very briefly if I want to talk about it. I simply told him no, but that was strangely enough of an answer for him, and the last I ever heard or experienced anyone even trying to talk about it with me ever. It was like he only brought it up to have an excuse to pretend he cared, be able to mention to others that he brought it up to me and gossip that my reaction seemed indicative of me somehow being at fault, and somehow try to manipulate me into seeing it as insignificant and acting in a way validating Chloe's blatant massive disrespect and hateful attitude and behavior towards me if I'd chosen to speak about it to him. I literally never gossiped or got into the personal lives of anyone else, and nobody ever shared their or others' personal lives with me. I was actually on really shallow, distant terms with every person I ever considered a friend in high school, even far beyond just the friend group with Chloe in it. The only reason I know she had family issues is because she personally, directly told me right after traumatizing me with how she dealt with me in that one-on-one encounter that day. And you know what? It gets even more shady. The next day, Jerry approached me in the by far most aggressive manner I'd ever experienced from him and asked me if I'd asked to touch Chloe's butt. Not even if I'd actually touched it. So either she told him I asked and she refrained from telling him I reached for it despite her verbal non-consent, and then she opened up to me after, or she told him I reached for it after, despite her rejection, and she'd massively warped the narrative about what had really happened so she could make herself look like a victim to me being extremely creepy, instead of the reality that she'd extremely creepily massively led me on, been blatantly brutally racist towards me, and tried to emotionally dysregulate me and traumatize me, and then guilt trip me with her trauma dumping, and set me up to look like I'm either secretly attracted to men, or a creepy prick that wanted to make her feel extremely ugly or hurt her somehow all along, or both. I saw what she was doing, and so I just denied it casually, and Jerry seemed to believe me, but that wasn't the end of it either. Within a few weeks after, Chloe posts a picture with her standing upright, body facing away from the camera, looking over her shoulder with her legs spread a bit more than shoulder width apart, and her butt in tight jeans front and center. She used some cosplay of some anime character I'd never heard of in some anime I'd never heard of as an excuse to show off her body in a way that the private encounter we'd had would have obviously indicated to her would turn me on massively, simply because it gives a clear view of her butt and does so in a manner where it's like she's acknowledging that I'd be staring at it and touching myself to it, and she's not just allowing but even encouraging it. I've never preferred or particularly desired to see anyone in any cosplay or uniform, nor have I ever found jeans in general to be particularly arousing at all for any reason on anyone. Nor have I ever, even to this day, said or done anything in my entire life to anyone that actually should at all suggest otherwise to anyone. But I guess Chloe just realized how blatantly toxic and strange it is to just randomly post a highly uncharacteristic picture with her butt as the focus in a plain outfit shortly after she started fabricating some kind of really screwed up false narratives about me and my feelings towards her. And she obviously didn't know or care about my latex fetish and how I fantasized extensively daily about seeing her in extremely glossy black latex leggings, because I'd never share stuff like that with anyone back then. So she needed some kind of excuse to push whatever warped false narratives about me she was trying to create, and she came up with what she came up with. But what she was doing was extremely shady, and I saw no way to actually pursue a healthy relationship with her with the way she was acting, and I was never after some extremely toxic relationship. I remembered the situation she had left me in and how she wasn't approaching me or communicating anything in any kind of even remotely healthy way to me, so the only reaction I saw as appropriate was to simply silently touch myself to that picture extensively in private and completely refrain from sharing me doing so in any way with anyone. I really wanted actual physical intimacy with her, but she clearly wasn't interested in it or having any kind of healthy connection with me. So I took what I got. Although it was far from the classy black latex leggings and latex top that would turn me on by far the most to see her wearing, I was still extremely turned on, way more than anything else in the entire world. I could actually touch myself not only to an actual picture of her butt, instead of just some memory in my head that I struggled to even visualize because I've always had aphantasia, but a picture she herself consensually posted online, knowing I'd see and touch myself to it and feel she had given me intense, fully conscious and intentional validation and encouragement to touch myself to. Within a few weeks after that, I guess Chloe really was extremely invested in trying to make herself look good at my expense and ruin my life with her lies, because she obviously fully consciously and intentionally got up from sitting on the floor one day as she was looking at something on Herman's laptop screen across the hall from me. And keep in mind, this was a hallway that spanned a total width of only about 3 meters. And she turned around in front of Herman, who happened to be sitting directly right across the hall from me at the time. And she bent all the way right over at a literal 90-degree angle, basically right in front of my face, so she could strangely look at, I don't even know what, on Herman's laptop screen upside down. She remained in that position for, I don't even know, because it's not like I was counting, but let's just say it was certainly well over just a few seconds. It must have been at least a solid, minute or two. She had her butt basically right in my face for quite a while. It's like she really wanted to make it a point to let me stare at it. But of course, I would have looked like a massive creep if I had, and I was so extremely painfully aware of that even though I really wanted to so extremely badly, I really had to control myself. I couldn't help but take a few quick glances, but I really tried to pretend like I didn't care. Secretly, though, I was thinking the whole time about how many times I'd secretly touched myself fantasizing about getting such a view from her. And I was already thinking about how I'd secretly touch myself for a long time to come, remembering the experience. Even though I despised Chloe's toxicity and how she clearly was doing what she was doing for the wrong reasons. I'd never told anyone I wanted such a view from Chloe, nor had I ever said or done anything to anyone else that would even really so much as hint at it. But Chloe obviously would have been able to guess based on the reality of that encounter we'd had in private. I greatly would have preferred if the situation was very different and it was an intimate relationship context with us being alone together and her ideally wearing extremely glossy black latex leggings. But that will only ever be a fantasy for me, I guess. I'm not going to deny that I've touched myself to Chloe's body thousands of times since. I guess maybe that sounds quite creepy to a lot of people, but that's an extremely pretentious attitude to have. Despite the fact that she'd never even once done so beforehand, she obviously fully consciously and intentionally showed off her butt in a picture she posted publicly to the internet, not very long after I'd expressed clear, very significant arousal by it. And then she bent all the way right over, right in front of my face, as if to solidify extremely clearly her desire and intent for me to touch myself to her as much as I wanted. How am I creepy for embracing my natural desires, for enjoying the view of a grown female's butt that I find extremely arousing, that she clearly, fully consciously, and intentionally gave me extremely intense validation to touch myself to as much as I want? I've always only ever fantasized tender and healthy things like her wearing latex leggings and letting me rub up against her or touch myself to her in front of her while she was watching and perhaps tenderly, verbally, and non-verbally encouraging it. And it's not like I've only touched myself to her butt. I've touched myself plenty to her face and breasts as well, if we're really going to talk about it. I'm creepy because I'm not attracted to men. I'm creepy because I don't want to live my life massively suppressing the arousal Chloe's body makes me feel. I'm creepy because I don't want to live my life filled with regrets and denying who I really am out of some kind of shame or guilt I shouldn't have. Yeah, right. Chloe's the actually creepy one for wanting to show off her butt to me and give me such intense validation to indulge in arousal for her body how she did, and in reality seeing with absolute certainty that I only ever had warm and good intentions towards her, yet her never wanting to actually have any kind of even remotely healthy connection with me, and in reality she was an extremely racist and hateful narcissistic psychopath towards me in response. I don't, shouldn't, and will never feel ashamed at all for how I acted, because I know the truth. I'm just authentic and actually a really good person, and really bad people stand to gain by trying very hard to lie about me and hide the truth. Would I randomly go around asking to touch or actually touching women's butts despite explicit verbal non-consent? Of course not. Do I normally extremely extensively touch myself to a woman's butt just because they might show it off somehow and give possibly even quite blatant considerable validation to touch myself to it as much as I want? Of course not. Am I trying to encourage or somehow influence anyone else to do any of these things? Of course not. My life would be very different if I was. What's even more screwed up and evidence of how badly she's been lying, and what brings this whole story back around to the hair dyeing thing, is that at one point in high school, well before it had reached the point I was ignoring Chloe, I told her in front of Jerry and Herman and some other people that were in that friend group that I thought pink and purple were nice colors for hair. I don't remember exactly how I said it, but I was essentially saying I wanted to dye my hair those colors, and I thought someone I find attractive dyeing her hair those colors would be something I find appealing and maybe make her a little more attractive to me. It was literally just a completely innocent comment with no ulterior motives or hidden meanings whatsoever. It wasn't even something that important or significant or influential to my life. At the time, Chloe looked at me with a disgusted expression and told me I'm weird and stupid and she'd never do it. I shrugged it off and didn't really care because, again, it's never been and still isn't something that holds deep meaning or achieves any ulterior motive for me for anyone to dye their hair any color or combination of colors, regardless of what people think about it or who might or might not ever like it or do it. Keep in mind, I wasn't ever even telling her to do it, just mentioning it randomly, in general. I never specifically told or requested or even really so much as hinted that I specifically wanted anyone to do it, much less ever said anything to anyone or did anything to even so much as remotely suggest that I was after specifically Chloe dyeing her hair any color after high school ended, or that her doing so was anything that at all opened up room for a healthy connection between us, or actually indicated any kind of apology or change of heart from her towards me, and the extremely brutal, literally blatant, racist rejection of me she'd done the way she'd done it. But literally for years after high school ended, Chloe was constantly dyeing her hair different shades and combinations of pink and purple. For years. She never contacted me or tried to communicate with me at all. At least certainly not in any even remotely healthy, serious, or realistic way, since I haven't at all been made aware of any attempts from her to contact me at any point in time. The only time I've ever spoken to her since high school was one time, years ago, at a convention I went well out of my way to attend just to approach her at her booth and tell her about the book I was writing at the time, which had an autobiography portion where she was substantially mentioned in, obviously in the negative light of the reality of what she'd done. I was giving her an opportunity to try to explain herself and maybe even start treating me much better if she'd genuinely changed at all. But all she did was massively disrespect me and make me look like a creepy, crazy stalker. She called security on me, effectively simply for literally just trying to talk to her calmly and maturely in a dignified manner, and tried to extremely brutally humiliate and hurt me as much as possible all around, while blatantly telling me right to my face that she hasn't changed since high school. In personal investigative work I did years later after I started seeing extremely strange things constantly happening in my connection with Kimmy, and how the hair dye thing seemed extremely strangely influential out of nowhere over and over, I learned Chloe extremely strangely stopped dyeing her hair pinks and purples and posting that to her personal accounts online right around the time that I met Kimmy. Coincidence? I'm only increasingly starting to believe not. It seems it was just clear evidence she was not only involved in slander and likely also criminal impersonation of me for years, but also that she was stalking me the whole time and actively trying to sabotage anything good I tried to get going for myself in life. I'm 30 years old right now. If I've known Kimmy for over 7 years at this point, that means I was around 23 when I met her. You graduate high school at 18, at least in Canada, where I'm from. So Chloe was so extremely obsessed with pushing some extremely false narrative about me behind my back, entirely at my expense and against my consent, wishes, and best interests through her blatant public behavior, for at least a solid 5 years already. And she was extremely severely abusing dyeing her hair the whole time to try to fabricate supposed evidence for it being true. Meanwhile, I never spoke to her or really any of my other ex-friends from high school, and none of them really cared to ever try reaching out to me at all either. I completely cut them all out of my life within about a year after high school ended for me. Yet it seems likely that multiple of them were actually in reality slandering me and stalking me behind the scenes all along, and likely at least some of them to some extent also abusing connections with blood relatives of mine to further exacerbate the damage to my life with additional false narratives my piece of trash blood relatives were selfishly gaining off perpetuating about me in their own ways for their own selfish goals as well. So here we are, many years later, with me having to spend like an hour explaining to the world how some random nobody loser who I went to high school with over a decade ago is genuinely a massive piece of human filth that's most likely directly actively causing me torment right now in my connection with Kimmy, because I'm pretty sure that I'm being stalked, criminally impersonated, and slandered behind my back, and have been for years by people I used to be somehow close to, entirely at my expense, against my consent, and thoroughly unjustly. And now, I have nobody, and people are lying extremely badly about the reality of how they treated me, what kind of person I am, and why I cut them out of my life. Why? Because they're extremely delusional, toxic pieces of filth that live in massive denial of the truth and don't want to take accountability for who they really are and face the consequences they deserve as karma for their actions. So they think they can perpetually shift blame in devious ways and force me to suffer living some extremely miserable life I'm extremely thoroughly undeserving of, and ultimately being sacrificed and dying an early death I'm extremely thoroughly undeserving of, just so they can be comfortable and continue being the massive pieces of garbage they are without facing any real or even remotely adequate consequences for the absolutely horrible way they treated me and the literally psychotic criminal things they did to me throughout my life. In multiple releases of this podcast, I've focused on my extreme concern that Kimmy might seriously be pregnant right now or planning to get pregnant, and I've been extremely clearly repeatedly stating the fact that I do not, never have, and never will validate that for any reason. And I've never even once done anything that should even remotely suggest otherwise to anyone. But it seems that I really have to be so extremely painfully meticulous in every detail I address about every aspect of everything I address when I deal with the kinds of enemies I have that are clearly such exceedingly, extremely severely malicious bad faith actors, relentlessly attempting to completely sabotage and negate everything I've worked so extremely hard to bring to light with this podcast, that I have to now even go so far as to make it extremely clear that I do not, never have, and never will even remotely really care if anyone that does or ever will exist ever is or becomes pregnant other than Kimmy. The only at-all exception to this is Chloe, Someone who I have what I consider extremely good reason to believe has been so extremely severely misrepresenting the reality of my connection with her behind my back, as if to suggest we are or ever have been dating at all, when in reality she's always just been nothing but extremely distant, toxic, and immature towards me. She's been especially deviously abusive, neglectful, manipulative, and generally antagonistic towards me ever since I first met her. The only reason I find it pertinent to extremely clearly, explicitly, thoroughly establish my position that I also do not want, need, benefit from, or have any legal or otherwise obligation or debt of any kind to anyone or anything to ever validate, encourage, or at all facilitate Chloe becoming or remaining pregnant if she ever gets pregnant somehow either, is because due to the nature of how extremely severely I'm quite sure the reality of my connection with her has been misrepresented to many, I want it extremely clear that the reality of my connection with her really is, as I've stated in this podcast, and not even slightly different to any extent. I have an extremely strong feeling that some kind of extremely serious narrative warping in relation to me must still be occurring in relation to her as well, and I want it extremely clear that it still extremely, deeply bothers and disturbs me to this day. I really don't see any even remote hope for any kind of healthy relationship with her for me ever, with how unbelievably extremely toxic and arrogant and fake she was back in high school, and blatantly flaunts to this day that she still is and doesn't see or feel any real need or desire or willingness to ever really at all meaningfully change in a positive direction. So I suppose I don't have quite as much of a place to demand that she never gets pregnant and that she promptly gets an abortion if she ever does get pregnant. But I personally believe she also should never have children with anyone for any reason. A very real part of what even caused her to become so unbelievably extremely arousing to me to the point that she's affected my life as much as she has is that her behavior towards me extremely strongly comes off to me like she seriously never really wants to have children with anyone and shouldn't ever have them even if she ever does feel like she wants to. It seems to me that it's impossible she'd ever want them for the right reasons, and therefore impossible she'd be an even remotely actually healthy parent, or even remotely actually healthily interact with whoever she would ever have children with. She already clearly has extreme difficulty acting like an even remotely decent human being without having to take any existential responsibility for a human being she brought into the world. Which is actually, in all honesty, in a way, a massive turn-on to me, because like I said, I seriously never want children with anyone for any reason. So someone that genuinely doesn't want children, or at least certainly is so extremely inclined to an attitude extremely unsuitable for ever having children, is actually something I find extremely attractive for that quality of it. But at the same time, I otherwise extremely strongly dislike immaturity or toxicity to any extent. Maybe that sounds confusing to a lot of people, but I'm not at all confused about it. Essentially, I'm well aware that many may consider it a toxic attitude for a woman to genuinely be extremely confident and certain she absolutely unconditionally never wants to have children with anyone for any reason at any point in time. But that's something I genuinely do, always have, and always will consider ideal and arousing. But that's literally the only attribute that I actually like or find arousing that might seriously be considerable as genuinely toxic in someone. And even then, I only really feel attracted to women that feel that way when they resonate with it in such a way where the woman is in reality deep inside genuinely most happy and at peace in life with feeling the way she does about it and living her life accordingly. I guess a lot of people probably would consider me actually toxic for being this way, but that's the only quality of my personality that I can really see anyone having any real room to consider genuinely toxic if they actually got to know who I really am. And even then, I wouldn't ever intentionally deal with anyone in a toxic way as a result of me feeling this way. So any toxic kind of effect I might ever have on anyone as a result is not actual toxicity from me, since real toxicity is intentionally harming someone with conscious malice. It's actually part of the reason that I'm extremely selective about ever even attempting to open myself to any kind of romantic connection with someone. I'm well aware that I'll probably end up hurting a woman if she starts feeling invested in being with me and thought I'd want to have children with her, and then she learns I genuinely find it extremely arousing and ideal for us to be sexually intimate extremely frequently, purely for pleasure, and never want children for any reason at any point in time with anyone. It's definitely not coming from a place of being scared to be close either, because I'd still want to see a person I'd be with as like family to me, and an actually positive, loving family member, not an extremely toxic piece of garbage like all my blood relatives were to me. I want to be so close to and focused on and frequently intimate with my partner that children only annoy me and I feel get in the way of the kind of life I want to live. And yes, this does mean I actually find it very much ideal and an arousing quality in a woman if she's naturally absolutely infertile and physically incapable of ever getting pregnant through any natural means, even with extremely frequent and extensive bareback intercourse that otherwise definitely would have resulted in pregnancy sooner or later. As far as I know, neither Kimmy nor Chloe are as such. But I was never going to deny my physical attraction to people and consider them non-viable as a life partner unless they're infertile, and I'm not going to force or expect a woman to take potentially life-threatening surgeries that might not even be completely reliable to attempt to forcefully make herself infertile. So I see it as more so a fantasy rather than a criteria that must be met. Ultimately, if someone's too mentally ill or just a generally horrible person that can't or doesn't want to really see and appreciate who I really am and how precious my feelings for them really should be to them, or they're not physically attractive enough to my tastes for me to want to be sexually intimate with them to begin with, it doesn't change anything whether or not the person's infertile to any extent anyways. Plus, I actually genuinely really enjoy wearing condoms anyways because of my latex fetish, and I don't have any kind of fixation on having bareback intercourse with anyone. So absolute infertility is, practically speaking, effectively not really anything more than just a nice little comforting bonus. I don't inherently believe you're a bad person if you have desire to have children or actually do end up having children. In general, I do believe a lot of people that end up having children aren't actually in a mental state suitable for being good or healthy parents, and I also believe a lot of people who have children don't actually have them for the right reasons. But that doesn't mean you need to be a perfect human to be worthy of having children. I mean, it's not like I consider myself to be perfect, whether I want children or not. I don't think being perfect is really, a thing. Maybe in a way everyone is perfect in their own way, depending on how you see things. I also recognize how the human race would go extinct if everyone felt the way I do about children. That being that I absolutely, unconditionally have thoroughly, absolutely no desire or willingness whatsoever to ever tolerate having children with or impregnating anyone ever, for any reason, through any means. And I've extremely, thoroughly, meticulously done self-reflection and introspection and rumination on this matter and can objectively, reasonably demonstrate that I'm genuinely, completely at peace with it, and it's not a result of any extent of mental illness present in me. But there will always be plenty of people out there that don't feel how I do about ever having children of their own. So it's not the end of the human race if I myself specifically choose to be one of those that don't want to ever reproduce. I also most certainly am not, never have been, and never will be after some ridiculous gigantic harem of the world's population of women, so the human race is also not even remotely at risk of extinction if I expect or require any partner I'd have to also refrain from ever having children with anyone. I don't try to preach or dictate to people in general that they need to or should follow the way I think or live my life in every regard, and this is one of the good reasons I have to do so. I'm not in the wrong for feeling how I do about having children myself, and you're not necessarily in the wrong if you feel differently about it for yourself. It just is what it is, at least as far as I'll ever be concerned. I wouldn't ever even attempt to make any solid assertions about whether or not anyone specific should have children unless I have extensive personal experience with them treating me some kind of way that gives me relevant insights into their personality and lifestyle. Since children and pregnancy are so heavily related to sexual desire, and this is clearly a topic being extremely seriously misrepresented about me, it seems that there's really no avoiding a need to elaborate on my sexual desires thoroughly here to eliminate any real room for anyone to attempt to misrepresent them somehow. I'd really prefer not to publicly go into detail on my sexual desires and experience, not because I'm shy or have anything to be ashamed of about it, but rather simply because I have the emotional awareness to know most people don't really need to know. This is too much information for most people, and I've never at all been trying to build a career of any kind off providing some kind of sexual entertainment, nor have I ever had any ulterior motives to indulge in sexual discussion or activities in public to any extent with anyone. But it seems I'm going to have to share a lot of significant details about my sexual desires quite openly here in order to be taken at all seriously by everyone that does need to know and understand. I want them to be thoroughly convinced of the truth in this regard. Many people also associate ASMR with being something sexual, so since I'm pretty sure there's extremely serious misrepresentation on how ASMR influences or relates to my life, I suppose simply stating the reality that I'm not some creep obsessed with anyone's ASMR isn't really an adequate defense against whatever slander and criminal impersonation of me that's going on. I touch myself to Kimmy extensively daily, and it brings me immense joy and pleasure that I know even actual physical sexual intimacy with anyone else wouldn't ever be able to compare to. Her body arouses me by far more than anyone else's, even though I've only ever seen her fully clothed in regular clothing. Over the years, I've followed her and noticed the pictures of herself that she posts on her socials and what she does on camera on her live streams. I've built up a collection of pictures of her butt, breasts, and face that I look at when I touch myself to her. It's literally all just from stuff she's posted publicly on the internet for the world to see. I very frequently fantasize about touching myself to her in front of her latex-clad body in classy, extremely glossy black latex leggings and top, while she watches and perhaps tenderly encourages me verbally and non-verbally. I also very frequently fantasize about tenderly caressing her body and rubbing up against her and cuddling with her, both with and without latex clothing involved. I'm considerably more aroused by even just the thought of doing these things with her than intercourse, although I'm certainly not disgusted at all by the prospect of intercourse with her either, as long as it's being done with the clear intent and adequate precautions taken to only ever be for pleasure and never for having children. As far as why her body is so incomparably arousing to me, well, for one thing, I have an extremely strong inclination towards finding Korean women especially attractive in general. Beyond that, between breasts and butts, I'm considerably more aroused by butts. For both, it's not necessarily about bigger being better, but rather about being the size and shape I personally consider ideal. I'm not too picky with breast shape or size, and I'd basically just say my criteria for perfection is anything bigger than a B cup and no bigger than a double D cup, which Kimmy's breasts meet. I am quite picky about butt shape and size though, and Kimmy's is just absolutely incomparable perfection to me in every way. I don't even need to see it naked to know. Even just seeing it in reasonably skin-tight regular clothing like I have multiple times before is good enough to know it'd look unbelievably amazing in the latex leggings I fantasize so much about seeing it in. I can't even completely describe it in words. It's just, look at Kimmy's butt, and that's my ideal of just an absolutely perfect butt all around. It's not even just the best I've ever seen in person. It's literally the best I could ever possibly fathom existing, with absolutely no exceptions whatsoever. But I don't want to make it seem like I'm just obsessed with her butt, because that's really not the case. Her face is actually the most attractive face I've ever seen in my entire life, and I've seen it without makeup before, and she's actually literally, without question, the most beautiful, sexy, gorgeous woman I've ever seen and can ever fathom existing either way. The entirety of her body shape and every part of it is beautiful and sexy like no other as far as I've ever been concerned, and I literally don't have and have never had any complaints about any of it. And I'm absolutely, genuinely, seriously not just saying that. Like, her appearance is perfectly fine the way she is, but she could even gain like 50 pounds, and I'm absolutely certain I'd still find her way more arousing than anyone else, even just purely from a physical appearance standpoint. Without question. I mean, I'm definitely not saying I want her to develop an eating disorder and gain like 200 pounds, because I'm definitely not into morbidly obese women. My point is that even if she's suffering right now and eating less than she'd like, because she feels like she has to maintain some kind of model body based on mainstream beauty standards or something, she really doesn't ever have to worry about that with me. And for the record, I've mentioned this before multiple times in emails to my mailing list over time as well. There are also various aspects of her personality and lifestyle that I really feel drawn to as well, if we're going to talk about her being the whole package to me. But if we're talking about just physical appearance, to find anyone even close to as sexy as Kimmy is to me, you basically would have to find someone that looks as close as possible to exactly the way Kimmy looks in literally every way possible. And even then, at the absolute very best, such a person would be just as physically attractive to me as Kimmy is. It's literally impossible to make any kind of change in any body part compared to Kimmy's to make someone else even slightly more attractive to me. At one point, years after I met her, Kimmy got what I'd consider an absolutely unnecessary chin surgery, but she was by far the most attractive person I could ever imagine before, and I wouldn't say her face is any more or less attractive afterwards, so she's still the most attractive person I could ever imagine. I guess at least she feels less insecure about her body now, so if she really felt that insecure about it for some reason, at least I know it wasn't me who caused that, and it just is what it is. I've literally never even once at any point in time said anything to anyone that would even slightly suggest anything at all is even slightly imperfect to me to any extent about Kimmy's physical appearance. I've only ever criticized her for her rather poor mental health, the way she's lied to and about me, disrespected me, neglected me, and facilitated others to do the same. And even then, I've always tried to do it in the healthiest possible way while still demonstrating a clear desire and need for her to recognize the need for healthy boundaries to exist in our connection. As far as the one other woman I've ever felt extremely intense physical attraction towards and ended up extensively touching myself to, Chloe isn't Korean, and I'd say she's still easily to this day and most likely will forever be to me by far the most physically attractive and arousing non-Korean person I could ever fathom existing. Her body is considerably different from Kimmy's in multiple regards, but what I'd consider absolute perfection in its own way. On the occasion that I ever touch myself to something that isn't Kimmy anymore, I'll often touch myself to Chloe. In the past, I'd touch myself multiple times daily to Chloe, almost exclusively, I'd say at a bare minimum of probably about no less than 5 times a day. That was the case since, early grade 10, and for several years, even after high school ended, with how much I'd touch myself to Kimmy gradually increasing over time ever since I met Kimmy. These days, I touch myself to Kimmy like I used to touch myself to Chloe at the peak of my arousal towards Chloe many years ago. I hardly touch myself to anything that isn't Kimmy anymore, and she just turns me on so much more than anyone or anything else with even just her physical appearance alone that it's not like I have to force myself at all. To me, she's just genuinely by far the most attractive female of any combination of any attributes that I could ever fathom existing. I've only ever felt at all romantically and or sexually attracted to females, and I've only ever at all touched myself to females my entire life, literally without even one exception ever, and I'm fully at peace with that fact and have absolutely zero desire or willingness to ever have that change at all, entirely regardless of how Kimmy or anyone else feels about it or what happens. The reason I gradually ended up touching myself to Kimmy more, as opposed to just suddenly starting to touch myself to her a lot right from the beginning, isn't because I've ever considered Chloe more physically attractive than Kimmy. Rather, that Chloe's behavior was nothing short of what I'd consider extremely intense validation for me to thoroughly indulge in touching myself to her extensively as much as I wanted for the rest of my life, and that was substantially more so the case than Kimmy's behavior being as such in a respective manner for quite some time after I first met her. Given the reality of my sexual desires that I have been extremely certain of for a very long time, since even well before I knew Kimmy exists, nobody's sex appeal through physical appearance alone was ever going to be capable of surpassing the arousal I feel for the combination of both Chloe's physical appearance along with the extent of the kind of validation that Chloe has given me. Although I've never wanted or enjoyed any part of it being done in the extremely toxic way that she did it for the wrong reasons, the fact that she's given me such extreme intense validation to do so at all was in and of itself already something nobody else had ever really done for me before, and was something I've always really wanted and enjoyed. However, given her attitude she's demonstrated and how she's extremely thoroughly proven she did it for the most wrong possible reasons, she's made it rather extremely painfully clear to me that she has absolutely no genuine desire or intent to ever escalate into the explicit pursuit of an actual relationship that she'd need to do for the right reasons in order to ever really give me any more validation than she already has of the kind I've always wanted and enjoyed. While Chloe's validation and physical appearance had effectively plateaued already well before I even knew Kimmy exists, Kimmy's behavior towards me since the beginning only gave me increasing validation to start touching myself to Kimmy increasingly frequently, more and more every day, and her physical appearance hasn't even slightly declined at all. Although I refrained from ever even really hinting to Kimmy that I touched myself to her for the first, couple years of our connection, eventually it reached a point that I did tell her, and with her immediate reaction being something that, basically from what I could tell, was intended to send me the message, she found it romantic and pleasing to her to know it was happening and that she was happy to have it continue happening, and her long-term reaction constantly reinforcing that same message from what I could tell, I've only felt increasingly validated in touching myself to her increasingly frequently since then and to this very day, and I'm most certainly not complaining. Ultimately, even if Chloe did ever do something to try to give me more validation to touch myself to her more at this point, Kimmy's body has always been and will always be significantly more arousing to me anyways, and Kimmy's also much more appealing to me as a life partner for multiple other reasons as well, so I've always been absolutely certain that I'd pick Kimmy over even Chloe if I somehow was given the choice to date either but had to pick only one, without hesitation. But like I said, the reality is that having such a choice isn't even the situation I'm facing anyways. Chloe has only made it abundantly, extremely painfully clear to me that she definitely actually in reality did what she did to me with extremely, exceedingly selfish and absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent towards me, so I'm only that much more certain that it's definitely being with Kimmy or nobody ever for me. I've never even really come close to actually dating, much less actually being at all physically, sexually intimate with either of these women. I've only ever been alone with Chloe once in my entire life, and it was in public at my high school in that one-on-one encounter I described in detail earlier. The closest I've ever been to being alone with Kimmy was in public when I took her to the side at the end of the meetup in Toronto over 7 years ago and told her I find her personality attractive and wasn't trying to hurt her feelings in what I said in front of everyone else. As far as personal or private conversations, I've had far more in my life with Kimmy in the several months she had Discord DMs open when I was first getting to know her than I've ever had with Chloe in total, whether in person or online. Chloe has been extremely toxic and abusive towards me in a very real way, quite similarly to how Kimmy has been, except it was even more devious, and the way she did it and how she's treated me ever since to this very day doesn't even leave any room for the possibility of her being able to embrace a healthy relationship with me ever. At least certainly as far as I can tell. I really can't even imagine her being able to ever act in a way where she can redeem herself in my eyes, whereas Kimmy just reaching out to me in a timely manner and coming off warm, honest, and open to clearly serious escalation of our connection into an intimate in-person relationship she clearly desires and intends to last for life is all it takes for me to happily engage with her attempts to connect with me and proceed in that direction. In either case, it's not at all any kind of masochistic enjoyment of their horrible treatment towards me that has ever at all aroused me. The vast majority of the arousal has always come from the sheer sexual appeal of their physical appearance that just happens to be especially to the liking of my sexual tastes. The rest comes from the notion of validating me, touching myself to them as much as I'd like to, in a way fully consciously and intentionally, thoroughly undesiring of ever having children, that their behavior towards me ever since learning of the kind of intensity of my attraction to their bodies made me feel they wanted me to know they give me and would enjoy knowing I feel in response. While touching myself to them, I've always been so extremely aware of the sheer arousal from their physical appearance that I've always known it's best I just try to completely avoid thinking about what possible underlying intent they might have had behind leaving me with such validation, because it's always been rather extremely questionable at best, and that just kind of ruins everything for me if I focus on it. So since I don't want the experience ruined for me, I focus on the parts of the experience I actually enjoy. I've always just figured that if they had good intentions, they'd be overjoyed to know, and eventually it'd become something more and my fantasies would be fulfilled in real life. And if they had bad intentions, I'm definitely not the creepy one in the situation for feeling how I do, and I'm definitely not going to deny my obviously extremely intense, objectively, fundamentally healthy sexual desires towards someone because of what becomes demonstrably their extremely severe mental illness. If I don't touch myself to either of those women, it's pretty much certainly because I'm really in the mood to see a latex-clad woman and touch myself to that, in which case whoever I'd end up touching myself to is rather inconsistent, and it's among a wide range of content of latex-clad women I've found on the internet. In more recent years, with AI becoming more prominent and publicly accessible in a high quality for image generation, I've collected a bit of a library of AI-generated, mostly random, nameless latex-clad women, almost exclusively Koreans, who I'd most likely touch myself to in that case. Like I've said before, if I was in a healthy, sexually intimate, proper relationship with Kimmy, I wouldn't even mind her sometimes telling me my sexual desires are pathetic or something like that if she really wanted, but not out of any kind of masochistic tendencies. I imagine she might feel compelled to sometimes say things she might be concerned I'd be upset about coming off insulting or degrading, because she'd feel insecure about if I'm genuinely happiest being intimate with her, how we'd be intimate together, and she'd want tender but convincing validation that I genuinely don't find anyone else better. I'd want to soothe her worries and comfort her that her feelings are valid for wanting validation that she's really the best person I could ever imagine being with. In that case, since it'd likely arouse her and make her happy and inclined to want more sexual intimacy with me if I was okay with it, and I'd want pretty much as much sexual intimacy with her as possible at all times, I'd be aroused and happy to facilitate that in that rather easy and pretty cozy way. I can just make sure I've clearly established my boundary that I don't enjoy or tolerate her being genuinely cruel and humiliating me for pleasure or fun in any context, especially not as if it's something I do or should enjoy, because I very much don't, never have, and never will. As long as she respects that boundary, I'm happy to give her all the validation she needs to feel overjoyed to be intimate with me when we'd be alone together, being intimate. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to make in saying that is that I need to start feeling genuinely, extremely deeply loved and respected by Kimmy at all times moving forward, or we really will have an extremely serious, absolutely unconditionally escalating problem. But that's not a double standard. I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with her reasonably holding me to the same standard towards her. I'm already currently extremely thoroughly doing that to the absolute best of my ability within my capabilities, as demonstrated by the existence and state of this podcast being what it is, among other things. Even if we were in a proper relationship, I've always preferred Kimmy talking in her regular voice at a regular volume the vast majority of the time, far more than she whispers, regardless of whether or not we're being sexually intimate. While I imagine I'd enjoy Kimmy whispering in my ear sometimes if we had such a relationship, I don't see her or anyone else's ASMR at all in a similar way. I never have, and I never will. My sexual desires are what I'd consider very healthy and compatible with my overall mental framework and aspirations in life, so I have no mixed feelings about liking anything I like and not liking anything I don't. I've always understood all my sexual desires very well from even the very beginning of my connection with Kimmy, and I've never at all been confused about any part of them or at all intentionally misrepresented anything about them to anyone. Anyone at all suggesting or somehow attempting to communicate otherwise is blatantly, fully consciously, and intentionally maliciously misrepresenting the reality of my personality and how I've lived my life. From the point of losing my virginity in my early 20s to this day, I've only had actual physical sexual intimacy in my life a handful of times, and always exclusively with cis female escorts. All of them were Asian, and most of them were Korean. I have absolutely no regrets at all about any of it. I've had intercourse with all of them. In every case, I enjoyed the physical sensations of everything we did together, and was only further certain I'm very much, strongly and exclusively attracted to women. But I was left extremely deeply craving the tender, emotionally sensitive intimacy regularly involving classy latex clothing that I've always craved with an actual partner for as long as I can remember. I don't maintain, and don't have any desire to maintain, any kind of connection with any of the people I've had sex with in the past. I very much see those cases as simply me paying for a service meeting a physical, mental, and spiritual craving I had at the time. There certainly seems to be a need for me to be willing to come off at least a little intimidating, because I want to make sure it's clear I'm not enjoying or somehow benefiting from continued disrespect and neglect. I'd imagine even just the fact that I'm so meticulous and persistent with speaking the truth about my life in a manner that likely none of my enemies have ever seen before is already in and of itself intimidating. But I'm really not trying to come off mean or aggressive towards Kimmy. I've never enjoyed being confrontational. I simply recognize the need for me to make sure people understand extremely well that I'm not a naive idiot anyone can get away with disrespecting and neglecting extremely badly and treating like I'm some predatory or somehow abusive piece of garbage while pretending they're somehow the victim of supposed abuse from me, while in reality they themselves have been acting abusive towards me all along. The reality is that anyone that tries to act like what I'm doing here is toxic or abusive or fake at all, they're the ones actually being toxic and abusive and fake. It's not a turn on to me for anyone to act abusive, but that doesn't necessarily mean I absolutely unconditionally despise them or am being fake or their body is any less of a turn on for me if I find it arousing. I recognize that Kimmy must have been hurt a lot in her life, that the vast majority of that pain definitely wasn't caused by me, and that if she gains proper perspective on everything, she'll ultimately see that even any pain I've caused her was pain she basically caused herself because she was being insecure and basically, somehow trauma dumping, or whatever you want to call it, onto me, either with her words or her actions or both. I genuinely can forgive her if she'll start seeing things clearly and treating me a lot better the way I want and deserve. I really can, as long as she starts actually listening and processing what I'm saying properly and getting a clearer, more healthy perspective on things and treating me properly before it's really too late. Things will be okay. At least for me and her. I don't know or honestly particularly care about everyone else. And since, believe me, I recognize that can sound scary or abusive, when I say treat me how I want, don't think I'm saying that as if I'm trying to abusively control her and I'm now dictating to her that even if I want her to feel horrible or do things that make her extremely uncomfortable and hurt or something, she has to just accept misery or abuse or hating life to make me feel good. Me being a good person and having always had good intentions towards her from the very beginning means that with the way she's responded to my existence, the things I want are clearly things that are ultimately good for her too and will make her feel really good too, even if maybe initially it's to some extent scary or uncomfortable. Although I won't let my self-respect get walked all over, that doesn't mean I won't be doing my best to make her feel safe and comfortable with me and loved and respected and wanted by me at all times. I'm not the type that would expect her to make me feel that way while not making her feel that way in return. And I certainly haven't been trying to work towards a relationship with her where we don't make each other feel that way. And although I'll never forget what she put me through, I don't need to forget it to love her better than anyone else. In fact, I'd say it's because I remember that I'll make sure she remembers to direct whatever negative feelings might arise in her properly at what's actually causing them and help her deal with things in a healthy way rather than her lashing out at me or generally dumping her issues onto me somehow and doing unhealthy things and then getting upset at me when I don't facilitate her comfort at my own expense or I don't let her slowly downward spiral in life. If she communicates with me properly, then I'll be able to understand what she's going through a lot better, and it's much less likely that I'm going to end up in situations where I have to attack her somehow. I'm assuming that whatever life she thought she'd have by getting away with devastating and destroying mine through the kind of attitude and behavior she's had towards me up to this point, she wanted what she ultimately considers a relationship that brings her pleasure and feels worthwhile. Maybe she thought a strange, really unhealthy relationship would bring her that somehow, but I'd argue a special kind of healthy relationship would bring her that much more so. I believe that rather than an unhealthy relationship, she just wanted one that isn't normal. Our connection was never and will never be normal. But I'm genuinely not at all angry or sad about that, since I never wanted a normal relationship either. And I can see that no matter what anyone says, Kimmy's objectively made it abundantly clear that she never really wanted a normal relationship either. Maybe she'll experience some confusion at times, but I don't see why we couldn't just work through that together if she doesn't seriously push my boundaries too far. I've never been under some delusion that it makes any real sense to believe I'd ever have a romantic relationship with anyone that's free of disagreements or misunderstandings. I really don't know what she'll decide, but she's seriously running out of time to make the right decision, and I'm going above and beyond to make absolutely certain that I've made it abundantly clear it should be understood that my position seriously doesn't ever change regardless. I'm actually never moving on from Kimmy, literally no matter what. I'm not over here looking for Kimmy to behave in some way that I can say justifies me moving on or lashing out somehow. She's actually just destroying herself and antagonizing me extremely severely from all of her associates as well if she continues disrespecting and neglecting me like she's been for so long. And I'm making it abundantly clear to the world that that's not what I want, have ever wanted, or will ever want. That doesn't mean it won't happen if she really doesn't care about taking things there despite everything I've done, though. I've always cared about Kimmy a lot. But no amount of me caring about her will matter if she really doesn't actually care about herself or our connection enough. If she continues to effectively not really care about ever having an actually genuine and healthy relationship with me, she's seriously just going to see me follow through on going down the extremely dark path I've described, one step at a time, one day at a time, just like I've said. So it should be extremely clear that I won't be tolerating her attempting some ridiculously opportunistic garbage later if she thinks she can try crying and complaining and throwing herself pity parties and begging or whatever, and everything will be fine. It really won't be. At all. There's only so far she can take acting like she seriously has a death wish before her wish will and should end up being granted one way or another. It's not like I haven't been patient with her. But there's a very real distinction between expecting patience and expecting stupidity and an unacceptably, extremely severe lack of any real boundaries in a connection. And I definitely draw the line at Kimmy legitimately terrorizing me with extremely serious reason for concern that she's pregnant or planning to get pregnant, and at all trying to get me to ever even remotely validate that, especially through presenting false narratives about the reality of who I am that try to abusively force control over my life somehow. And I know Kimmy knows very well that the reality is I've never even once done anything that at all should suggest otherwise would have even remotely possibly ever been the case. In fact, everything I've done has always made it remarkably clear I'd act the kind of way I'm acting right now if she pushed my boundaries like she has. Whether or not she's sane enough to recognize that, it doesn't change that it's the truth anyone reasonably sane would quite easily see extremely clearly with the amount of information about me and our connection that Kimmy would have. I don't, never have, and never will believe in the notion that it's even possible that the person or relationship I need or deserve in my life isn't the one I want. If I don't actually want to be in a relationship, it's not going to make me happy no matter what it offers, and therefore, as far as I'll ever be concerned, it's not really what I need or deserve either. If I'm going to be with someone, I need and deserve a relationship with someone I actually want and that makes me feel genuinely filled with joy to be with them. Otherwise, I'd genuinely, infinitely rather be single. That doesn't mean I prefer being single. It just means I actually have real standards and I'm not at all desperate to be in a relationship. That being said, I want to once again reiterate that I'm fully consciously and intentionally going to extremely great lengths to make it abundantly extremely clear that I'm being completely genuine in the opportunity I'm giving Kimmy here, and I'm extremely serious about the fact that I don't want, have never wanted, and will never want to have to be her worst enemy instead of her best lover. Having very much real boundaries that very much thoroughly make sense is very different from wanting to be enemies or being somehow fake or toxic or a bad person. I'm putting such an immense effort that should show Kimmy extremely thoroughly that I don't want her to feel like the kind of connection I've always been after having with her would be something I resent her for also wanting or pursuing. I've never wanted and will never want her to feel at all confused about my feelings and how real everything I've said in this podcast really is. I recognize that I'm putting Kimmy in a position where she effectively needs to be with me properly and start extremely seriously, clearly, promptly pursuing that with direct communication with me, or her life's doomed absolutely unconditionally. But she should want to be with me anyways and not feel forced or bitter about it, just like I don't feel forced or bitter to want and pursue the kind of connection I always have been with her. I genuinely don't want, enjoy, or benefit at all from seeing her continuing to suffer and basically punish herself for whatever she's put me through. And I certainly don't have any kind of legal or otherwise obligation to ever at all allow or encourage it. There really isn't anything I'll ever allow into my life that anyone might ever see as some kind of appeal for me to abandon my integrity in my connection with her. With that also being said, I want to make sure it's also extremely clear that everything I'm saying, have ever said before, and ever might say in the future in this podcast, in no way, shape, or form should be taken as any kind of inherent invalidation or change of heart, reasoning, perspective, or position regarding anything else I've said in this podcast. This applies broadly to everything, but I find it especially pertinent to once again especially mention this in relation to the fact that if Kimmy's pregnant right now, she absolutely unconditionally, seriously needs to get an abortion immediately, literally no matter what. I have no moral or otherwise hang-ups about Kimmy getting an abortion, and I really couldn't care less if anyone else does either. If Kimmy's pregnant, she never should have gotten pregnant. I seriously, absolutely, unconditionally am never validating it, have never validated it, and will never validate it with anyone, for any reason, ever, literally no matter what. This is not, never has been, and never will be, at all, up for negotiation. Seriously, and trying to debate it is extremely stupid and thoroughly futile. Absolutely, unconditionally. I also want it to be extremely clear that me saying and meaning that is not me trying to imply I'm doing all this to teach Kimmy some kind of lesson that she deserves to suffer and be denied of the genuinely wonderful and loving relationship with me that I'm repeatedly extremely clearly stating I've always been after having with her. Like I said, I've witnessed Kimmy publicly extremely seriously talk about her lack of genuine desire to have children enough times to know that if she's pregnant right now, someone definitely manipulated her somehow into wanting or allowing it, and in reality, even if she says or seems to act otherwise, she doesn't really want that child. It's really seriously for the best that such a pregnancy is promptly aborted for everyone involved. It really is. Anyone that thinks otherwise is seriously delusional, and things are seriously going to end extremely badly if they ignore or neglect to take adequate proper action in response to what I'm saying here. I really don't know who would have manipulated her into getting pregnant or how, but I can tell you it wasn't me, that's for sure. Anyone at all attempting to communicate otherwise is wrong. There was a point where I felt compelled to try to entertain the possibility that maybe it would have been the best scenario for me to have Kimmy and Chloe at the same time, and allowed them both to act in a way where if they were treating me the way they were because they were trying to make me see that, then I would have accepted I definitely would rather have both at the same time forever than neither. But clearly, that wasn't what was happening. It was more like some extremely unhinged, mental illness-driven competition between multiple groups of people who are extremely serious enemies of mine, who have always been operating completely against me and trying to rob me of my soul and destroy my life for their own selfish gain, who just completely took advantage of the abuse these two women were already inflicting on me to facilitate their own abuse added on top into my life. Can't say I'm surprised, since that always seemed to me like the much more likely realistic situation, rather than some really unbelievable situation where somehow Kimmy and Chloe were fully consciously and intentionally cooperating with each other in an effort to end up happily sharing me with each other and frequently engaging in really passionate, tender, in-person, three-way physical sexual intimacy with me for the rest of our lives. I absolutely unconditionally refuse to at all behave in a way that even slightly comes off as chasing Chloe ever again. Her ego is ridiculously, absolutely, thoroughly, unacceptably massive. This is a woman that, if she had any semblance of real decency and sanity, should have already long ago been reaching out to me directly with extremely loving and warm direct communication that was practically desperately begging me for direct communication back, and explicitly thoroughly demonstrating to me extreme eagerness to thoroughly sexually satisfy me with in-person physical sexual intimacy together, and being overjoyed at even just the possibility of me touching myself to her latex-clad body in her presence while she perhaps watches and tenderly encourages it. Instead, this unbelievably, ridiculously toxic, massive loser, who extremely cruelly flaunts and even seems to extremely disgustingly take pride in the fact that she's the same extremely fake and toxic, cruel loser who hasn't emotionally matured at all since high school, and whose physical appearance has even considerably deteriorated in the last decade, with her gaining, over 100 pounds because of intense overindulgence in eating, expects me to unbelievably, extremely pathetically, desperately chase her and beg her for any remote chance of any kind of warm connection with her, entirely on her own terms, despite the overwhelmingly abundant evidence that ever even considering that is just straight up falling into a huge death trap she's tried to set up to drive me to suicide or somehow else thoroughly ruining my life so she can get away with the extremely horrid disrespect, neglect, and slander of me that she's done over the years. Meanwhile, I've considerably lost weight since high school, become much more intelligent and emotionally aware and mature, built sensitive and powerful connections with highly influential people who are undoubtedly low-key obsessing over how powerful and interesting my personality is, and overall put immense effort into completely distancing myself from all the extremely toxic pieces of garbage from my past among people I used to consider friends and family that only proved over time, increasingly extremely painfully clearly, that they were all nothing but extremely fake, manipulative, toxic deadweight in my life, trying to bring me down and sabotage my success constantly in every way they could, while constantly proving to the world with every passing day how dedicated, emotionally aware, intellectually capable, and sincere of a person I am, and remain even as I get older and despite all the malicious, bad faith actors that relentlessly continue to inflict extremely vicious, brutal existential assaults upon my life. Chloe can watch and suffer, recognizing extremely painfully clearly how exceedingly unacceptable of a piece of complete garbage she is, that she was never hotter than Kimmy in any regard to begin with, and that should have been abundantly clear to her, but she has always had an ego even far bigger than I've ever seen Kimmy demonstrate. Chloe seriously expected me to be so exceedingly, ridiculously, pathetically obsessed with some extremely delusional memory of her because of a couple extremely devious, underhanded, intense love-bombing behaviors she did back in high school over 10 years ago, and now she's probably secretly extremely angry that I'm not the extremely pathetic loser she was betting on me being. It really sounds unbelievable, but after having lived the life I have, I really have no choice but to believe it, since it's so extremely painfully, clearly, completely true. I've really reached the point where I genuinely don't care even if Chloe would literally unalive herself or get somehow else unalived in real life if the truth is exposed. I never deserved or wanted what she put me through with her massive lies and abuse. At all. I don't know what people thought, but my issues with people I'm continually being given exceedingly good reason to see as nothing but my extremely serious enemies in an extremely serious, actual, literal, existential war to the literal death in real life isn't some petty grudge or exaggeration, and I'm never going to treat it as if it is. Time passing since some kind of abusive behavior was extremely clearly, directly, actively inflicted upon me is not any kind of anyone giving me an apology. The same way as my distance or lack of regularly going out of my way to disrespect people who have harmed me in the past isn't me accepting some kind of apology, giving some kind of apology, or any kind of admission or indication of any amount of guilt, forgiveness, or validation of any kind from my end. This doesn't just apply to Chloe. It applies to every person that's ever wronged me somehow, and there are many, even just among the ones I know of with absolute certainty. It really does go even as far and deep as my entire blood relatives from both sides. I don't even like using the word family for them just because they're related by genetics. I see absolutely none of them as family. You know, I'm well aware how horrible I've been treated by many people is so insane that a lot of people probably look at what I'm saying and think I'm embellishing things or exaggerating or even massively making things up, but I'm actually telling everything exactly as it is. While I unfortunately have not been recording voices or taking videos of the abuse and extremely shady behavior of my blood relatives, I know there also certainly isn't any real evidence what I'm saying isn't true. And ultimately, if these people hadn't treated me as extremely horribly as they had, I wouldn't have so much extremely good reason to antagonize them how I am, and will only ever continue to extremely thoroughly maintain my attitude in regards to literally no matter what. Believe me, I know the pieces of trash that are my blood relatives who I once called family must be aware of the content I post online and how I'm exposing their extremely abusive attitudes and behaviors towards me. They're definitely psychotic, controlling pieces of trash well into the territory of stalking me that hard and trying to sabotage everything I've been doing if there was any real room for them to. If I depended on any of them at all or had any intent on ever allowing any of them back into my life at all, I'd never be doing what I'm doing with this podcast. They would have forced me to take it down entirely, or at least certainly be something very different than what it so extremely clearly is. If you were to ask any of them, I'm sure they'll try their hardest to say or act like I'm some fake, entitled, spoiled, arrogant, delusional piece of trash. But they'll never tell you the truth of how they treated me or show you any real evidence to prove any of their claims of how horrible I supposedly am. They'll just try to slander me to anyone they can that's actually important to my life and try to keep me stuck so they can constantly keep me trapped in a situation where they can try to finish the actual attempted murder of me in real life that they started. My biological mother has always been extremely controlling and abusive towards me, constantly starting yelling fights with me over stupid things and that I didn't even have control over half the time, ridiculous and contradictory criticisms of me on a regular basis. Literally nothing I did would ever satisfy her or even just be able to convince her not to constantly pick fights with me that she persistently aggressed at me until she felt justified in turning into yelling, screaming arguments going nowhere and never really resolving anything or actually being fair to me. I was always the problem if you ask her, not her insane irrationality, mental instability, immaturity, and effectively constantly just using me as an emotional punching bag. She was a massive creep too. She was already such an extremely cruel, combative prick all the time that I'm sure it was very understandable why I never wanted to be at all vulnerable with her in any way. Yet she tried multiple times to push or provoke me into sexual discussions with her that clearly were not educational in nature by any means. She's done things like literally randomly out of nowhere asked me if I'm gay with my brother, for God's sake. Not just gay, but with my own biological brother. Disgusting. I've never even once done anything that should at all even suggest I'm attracted to men in general, much less at all attracted to my biological brother. I just told her she's disgusting and walked away, but she clearly wanted me to get defensive and start trying to prove my attraction to women to her in who knows what kind of way she was plotting, trying to manipulate me into feeling compelled to. Absolutely disgusting. The way my biological Uncle John from my biological mother's side, again the same piece of trash I mentioned in Out in the Cold, blatantly took my biological mother's side and refused to believe she was actually the problem in the connection, despite how extremely abusive I'd tell him she was. The way he proceeded to legitimately try to aggressively pressure me to go out walking late at night into an extremely dangerous area known for gun violence, and he thought I didn't know he was trying to set me up to get killed. And he tried to gaslight me about the integrity of the information I got from my sources I know are extremely credible in such regards. I bet he still thinks I don't know he seriously tried to set me up to eliminate me from real life, while pretending he was being a nurturing family member that was trying to show me I should have came to him for support earlier. He's probably so delusional he thinks I'll ever give him or anyone else in that family another chance to show me my biological mother and her family aren't the extremely screwed up total psychopaths I'm actually thoroughly, absolutely, unwaveringly certain they always have been ever since I had to endure the trauma of experiences like that, which convinced me I had to run far away from all of them and never look back. And then you have the massive piece of garbage that is my biological father. Lies to me that he cares about me and is willing to give me a real chance to start my own business when I want to leave my biological mother's extremely abusive household at 18. Starts increasingly frequently and brutally harassing and bullying me despite clearly seeing I work extremely hard every day, pretty much all day long, and don't even take weekends off. uses me in a court case to get petty revenge on my biological mother over a few $1,000s she took from their joint account and put into an RESP account under her own name while they were still married, then threatens to kill me in front of my biological brother, threatens the safety and arguably also life of my biological brother in front of me, and ultimately kicks both me and my biological brother to the streets. With my biological brother, it made sense because he was an extremely lazy, entitled, disrespectful moron. With me, I'd worked 10+ hour days doing game development and had even started live streaming it all and was growing fast with nearly 200 followers and consistently multiple concurrent viewers, and even was starting to get some donations within just my first, week and a half of doing it, with no friends or connections to help me starting out. And my biological father told me I'd be better off working at a fast food restaurant for minimum wage than starting my own business as a content creator and game developer with the objectively, demonstrably clear immense potential I was proving I had even back then. He criticized me for so long as going nowhere. Then as soon as I could prove I was extremely clearly going somewhere and on a come up, he fully consciously and intentionally sabotaged it completely and literally threatened to kill me to my face and kicked me to the streets to be homeless. But if you were to ask him, I'm sure to this day he'll deny it and act like he was such a good father and I was always the problem and some entitled delusional liar. Constantly massively disrespects me and acts like I'm worthless. Lazy, delusional piece of trash. Despite seeing how I put 10, 12, 14 or more hour days of work into my programming and designing to start my own business that clearly was producing results that just obviously take some time to really come together. Tells me I'm doing nothing all day. Compares my biological brother playing games all day while screwing around with his friends in voice calls to my working extremely diligently on game development with clearly programming and designing all day and not wasting my time messing around with talking or hanging out with anyone, online or offline, as the same thing. Last I spoke to him long ago, as I was about to fully cut him out of my life once and for all, he was trying to gaslight me constantly that my skills, knowledge, and life experience are all pathetic and worthless, and even multiple formally licensed mental health professionals evaluating me on court order, telling me right to my face that they don't believe I'm delusional or have any mental illness, are all wrong, and he is more qualified or can make a more accurate judgment about my mental health, despite his grossly inadequate qualifications in every sensible regard, just because he's seen how I live. As if living in a literal mental hospital, being observed 24/7 for months under conditions that strain and test one's mental fortitude and health far greater than being at liberty, isn't enough for legally, formally licensed mental health professionals putting their licenses to practice their careers on the line to make a more sound judgment regarding my mental health than some schizo television addict psychopath ex-screen printer that can't even articulate his thoughts in plain English at even half the proficiency I can, and either doesn't have or chooses not to actively practice application of insights into life even half as valuable as I do every day extremely consistently. And when I naturally then challenged him to go and be evaluated on any kind of level like I was and see what happens to him, naturally, the coward made pathetic excuses to avoid any actually meaningful measure of unbiased external input in regards to his unbelievably ridiculous assertions. And what's left? My biological brother? What an unbelievably delusional, entitled, spoiled brat. Both my biological parents always gave him a ridiculously easy time compared to the perpetual hellish nightmare they always put me through. I was the one stuck always having to fight them in their practically daily abusive yelling frenzies of irrationality and immaturity to defend my self-respect and sanity. But when it came to him, he hardly ever had to put up a fight, and they'd just demonize me to him, as if it's shameful to have real self-respect and actually clearly recognize their extreme abuse for what it really is. He'd regularly make an absolute mockery of me and criticize me for standing up for myself against our extremely abusive biological parents. And he was ridiculously ungrateful the vast majority of the time when I tried to give him guidance to navigate the brainwashing our biological parents were doing to him with their unbelievable toxicity. He's always been extremely quick to criticize me and justify our biological parents' behavior. He sees me as a horrible person because he refuses to acknowledge how our biological father schemed to kick both of us to the streets after the court case he took us in to use us to win and make it all seem like my fault. He got my unemployed, lazy brother a credit card with a $2,000 limit he'd obviously be unable to pay back, and then deviously, abusively pressured both of us, so I ended up in a situation where I seemed like a bad person and not serious about my game development if I wasn't willing to accept help from my biological brother, with accepting him buying me food on multiple occasions, along with some graphics and premature advertising our biological father once again basically forced on me, despite my cries I hadn't had a real, fair, adequate amount of time to prepare a product. But it's all my fault, in my biological brother's eyes, that he's not set for life already off spending a grand total of not even $2,000 on his credit card that largely went for food that half the time he would also be eating with me. He didn't even suggest making any kind of contract with me. He just acted like he's my boss or something because of the extreme brainwashing of the disgusting abusive favor my biological father always gave him over me, while extremely disingenuously acting like, and even literally explicitly verbally repeating, that he treats us the same. My biological brother clearly has an extremely poor or disingenuous grasp on the extent and long-term implications of extremely severe abuse of psychopaths as psychotic as our biological parents are. Last I heard, he still associates with and stays in contact with both of those pieces of trash. He's probably pathetically waiting to inherit whatever's left for him in our biological father's will. I've always said, let him have it. The loser will need it while he struggles with his multiple increasingly serious mental illnesses as he holes himself up in his room and just plays video games and does drugs all day like the massive degenerate loser with no ambition and no integrity that he is and always has been. And since I have an extremely firm grasp on the whole point of me even bothering to go above and beyond to extremely meticulously, thoroughly, completely, irrefutably, unquestionably demonstrate every aspect of my integrity and authenticity to the fullest in every aspect of my life, to the extent that absolutely nobody can even seriously attempt to hallucinate that any information they have about me even remotely serves as any kind of viable leverage over me to try to even slightly control me at all? You know how I say I have no contracts with anyone? Well, I say that for simplicity, because I have no contracts with anyone that at all restrict my freedom to do anything I actually want to do, or that at all compromise my integrity even slightly. However, technically, I have one contract I've actually agreed to that might possibly still be considerable as valid. It's a contract with my biological father that I agreed to well over a year ago now. The reason I didn't consider it worth mentioning or even really valid anymore is because one of the terms is that my biological father is not to ever again at all consciously or intentionally lie about, misrepresent, or otherwise damage the image or reputation of mine. But given how he couldn't go a day without doing so, somehow, at the very least to my biological brother, the entire time I ever had the displeasure and misfortune of having either of those scumbags at all in my life, I find it virtually impossible he's actually upheld this condition of the contract and isn't still deviously slandering me behind my back, therefore meaning he's already technically breached the terms and it's therefore liable to be terminated. I just don't care for suing him over it or ever renegotiating it regardless, since I just want him and all the rest of my blood relatives to stay the hell out of my life. But even in the scenario where he somehow decided to actually uphold the entirety of the terms of the contract and managed to have a discussion with my biological brother where he was actually speaking the truth about me and wasn't being an extremely manipulative piece of garbage, and yet managed to not cause my biological brother to promptly completely cut him out of his life, which for the sake of argument, let's say is the case, since it's not like I have voice recordings or something of him continuing to actively misrepresent me to my biological brother after cutting them out of my life completely, and I'm not going to try to get anything like that. The only real restriction on me in that contract is that me and my biological father will never again communicate, directly or indirectly, under any circumstances, for any reason. Technically also that I won't try to visit his house or live with him, but that's obviously a given if I'm not even communicating with him at all. It most certainly does not grant anyone at all permission or validation to even attempt to fake my death or commit any kind or extent of crimes towards me or under my name, or anything like that. Basically, as long as I never care for communicating with him or getting anywhere near him, which is something I actually wanted, since I'm the one that wants that piece of trash to never speak to me or be anywhere near me ever again, I'm not breaching any terms of the contract. And since he's already long since finished paying off the money I was owed in it, as long as he doesn't attempt communication with me in any way or misrepresent me at all to anyone, he's not breaching any terms of it either. A contract that basically gives me the best possible reason to completely cut out my extremely abusive biological father from my life, which I was always planning and desiring of doing anyways after I realized what kind of person he really is, and who the only reason I hadn't done so to earlier was because he kept trying to extremely abusively force his way back into my life through extremely devious means. That doesn't sell my soul at all. It doesn't make me a slave to anyone or restrict me in any way that at all compromises my integrity. It actually gives me the freedom to no longer have to stress about him constantly trying to harass, manipulate, stalk, and slander me. It actually protects my soul. We agreed he'd give me a total of $20,000 to agree to it, and I know damn well what his extremely scummy thought process was. He originally was trying to only offer me $10,000, but the amount was in reality just a technicality to him. Regardless of the amount, he was so clearly intentionally trying to prey on my downfall that he didn't even have the decency to give me all the cash outright. He specifically made the extremely stupid excuse that he just couldn't afford to give it to me all at once, to only give me a couple $1,000s at a time over multiple months, so I couldn't even have enough in my hand at one time to easily stabilize my housing at an affordable price long term or consider any other long-term larger purchase of anything. He basically paid just enough for me to be comfortable with food and renting a short-term rental for a few months, giving me comfort he thought in his delusional as hell mind I'm some spoiled brat I'd just carelessly be lazy in and give up on defending my integrity in this conflict with so many enemies working against me because of. And then I'd be even worse off after the money ran out, and I'd feel lost and hopeless in life. This piece of trash thought he was going to have me desperately begging him to come back into his life because he thought he was basically buying my soul with 20 grand and a hope I'm some pathetic loser he was hallucinating for many years that I am as what he perceived to be someone with a personality somehow in contradiction with all the objective evidence I'd constantly provide him to validate that I really am the person I've been saying I am with extremely thorough precious qualities that comprise my core value of refined pure bidirectional apprehension. If he ever tries bothering me somehow, then he's definitely a moron that gave me 20 grand for free. And I still won't communicate with him anyways. If he breaches this contract, it's the second time he's breached a contract we agreed he should never communicate with me directly or indirectly ever again because of, since the contract I'm talking about was actually a renegotiation of a previous contract that he actually blatantly breached by directly contacting me at an earlier point to harass me because he's always had zero real respect towards me and he's just that much of a scumbag. Yeah, I wanted him completely out of my life so badly for so long that this isn't even the first no-contact contract I've made with him in my life. Imagine, further violations from him now becomes criminal harassment since I've made it abundantly clear I never wish to hear from him, directly or indirectly, ever again. I don't need to communicate with him to press criminal charges on him if I ever learn he's committing or committed any serious crimes against me, whether attempting communication with me somehow or something more serious. Whether it's the scumbags that are my biological relatives, or the scumbags I used to call friends, or the various other scumbags that are simply jealous of me or just bad people in general that know things about my life, it's really ridiculous how the same people who blatantly, extremely badly lie about you, neglect you, disrespect you, try to selfishly gain somehow at your expense, might even yell at you completely unwarranted or try to extremely blatantly, directly, clearly, intensely pressure and influence you to behave in a certain way and somehow communicate you should expect they'll treat you a certain way they never ended up following through with even after you acted how they wanted many times, will be the same people who will act like you deserved whatever negative outcome that occurs because of their toxic attitude, behavior, and overall influence in your life. As if you chose to have them exist and ever come across you in your life, or as if your lack of actively seeking their immediate, thorough, permanent cessation of physical life in real life is some kind of fault of yours or validation of what they did to you. Oh, and if you do seek their immediate actual physical death in real life, that's also your fault and validation of what they did to you. So you're just a bad person in the wrong, a villain, literally no matter what. And they're just a poor victim of you, even though the reality is clearly the complete opposite. The reality is that nobody has any real dirt on me. Nobody has any real leverage on me. Nobody. And for anyone ridiculously, desperately trying to warp what I'm saying, nobody is not a person or an entity of some kind. Nobody means nobody. Nothing. There is no real leverage on me anywhere to try to force me to shut up or be a slave to anyone to any degree. I haven't sold my soul to any extent, and I most certainly do not have and will never have any reason I'd consider even remotely compelling to ever sell my soul. If you thought I'm a fraud every time I've talked about my integrity and authenticity and all my other qualities that a person with my core value has, you're seriously wrong. You've always been seriously wrong. And like I said, I'm only going to prove it more and more with every passing day. And not in the way people feel like I should, or try to manipulate or force me to. I'm going to prove it in the way that actually proves it. I really don't know what the reaction to this release will be and what will end up happening with this conflict, but I want to make sure I've made it abundantly, extremely clear that even if I really don't get the kind of relationship with Kimmy that I want and deserve, I'm seriously never compromising my integrity or changing my position. At all. Literally, no matter what. Things just go down an extremely dark path, absolutely unconditionally in that case. I'm meticulously drawing an extremely clear and serious boundary here that absolutely unconditionally must be respected. And I will make absolutely certain of that. Again, literally no matter what. if Kimmy's really just going to keep making excuses and acting deviously unhinged and toxic and ridiculously pathetically trying to warp the narrative and try to shift blame onto me endlessly while she's clearly the problem, I'm not going to compromise my integrity or become self-destructive or flail around trying to demand that I receive some kind of reward or compensation for everything I've done and been through. I'll just come to the understanding that I finally, successfully, extremely, thoroughly, meticulously drew the boundary that I needed in place in my life as I proved the complete reality of the matter in every at all relevant regard through this podcast and all the legally binding official statements that I've made through it, and that even that was made extremely painfully clear to me was effectively, absolutely, unconditionally, actually never going to be enough. And accordingly, I'll proceed to follow through on my threats and going down the extremely dark path one day at a time, one step at a time, as I completely isolate myself to the fullest at all reasonably possible extent from everyone across all areas of life, both online and offline, and just focus on game development and my general endeavors to achieve professional success without at all ever compromising my integrity. I won't be sharing any details with anyone. I'll work extremely hard in silence until absolutely nobody can stop me, and then I'll extremely, meticulously, thoroughly, completely execute on extremely, brutally, absolutely destroying every aspect of Kimmy's life and damaging the lives of every other massive piece of garbage that participated in this massive, extremely prolonged smear campaign and general abuse and existential assault towards me, with absolutely no doubts, regrets, second-guessing, hesitation, or wavering. Not even slightly. Ever. Literally, no matter what. Just like I said. I could literally have every other person, man, woman, or whatever the hell else you might consider yourself, desperately begging for my attention, love, business help, or deals, or whatever. And I genuinely, literally, absolutely, unconditionally won't even think twice to extremely, clearly, thoroughly reject it all. I seriously didn't endure the perpetual sheer hellish nightmare I did, only to end up extremely stupidly compromising my integrity in the end, and effectively being completely stripped of my immense, priceless power. When I say I'm not desperate for anything, that means something. A lot more than people seem to recognize or be willing to actually accept. Damn idiots. I'm not an idiot. My life has been such an extremely brutal, relentless, perpetual, sheer hellish nightmare while I've had thorough integrity all along. If I'm at all willing to behave in a manner compromising it, not only do I throw away things I'll forever want most in life, if it was ever at all possible I could achieve them, but I'll knowingly be plunging myself into even more chaos, confusion, and stress than ever before for what I'll forever consider no even remotely good or adequate reason to ever even consider enduring such, literally entirely regardless of what might be on the other side. Literally whatever it might be, that's most certainly not at all fun or some kind of adventure for me. That's genuinely just extremely unpleasant, miserable, depressing, stressful, and thoroughly, utterly intolerable to me. It always has been, it always will be, and I've literally never even once actually said or done anything to anyone that should at all even remotely suggest otherwise. Again, anyone at all attempting to present or somehow communicate otherwise is blatantly, fully, consciously, and intentionally lying against my consent, wishes, and best interests. I'm seriously not, never have been, and never will be at all tempted by things like having excessive amounts of fame, money, or a bunch of sex with different people. I might perhaps attain considerable financial wealth and fame eventually regardless, but that is not, never has been, and never will be my primary focus in life. I really and truly, absolutely, genuinely want nothing more in life than to promptly begin the genuine, frequently physically, sexually intimate relationship of life partner commitment with Kimmy that I've always been after. And at all somehow compromising my integrity most certainly isn't necessary in order to achieve that. In fact, it's quite exceedingly ridiculous for anyone to ever even remotely attempt to suggest it doesn't only really work completely against that. Which is precisely why I'm not, never have, and never will even remotely consider or find it at all appealing to do so. Being able to always authentically express myself is absolutely priceless to me, and it's going to stay that way. Anyone that doesn't like me because I'm not fake, shallow, or immature to any degree, too damn bad. Deal with it. Just like I have to deal with it every day for the rest of my life, that I tried so hard and got so far in trying to live an actually personally satisfying, joyful life, but in the end, it seems it really didn't even matter, and I couldn't even get the one person I couldn't be more wanting and deserving of getting to spend my life with in an extremely genuine, loving, intimate life partnership. Even after pouring my heart and soul into it for over 7 years of literally focusing with extreme relentless energy on it and sacrificing so much without even thinking twice about it. And that's not at all some kind of confusion or disingenuous thing when I say that. It's not toxicity or being fake or being depressed or anything like that. It's not some kind of hidden message of ulterior motives. I'm presenting extremely clearly that I'm sensitive to the probabilistic nature of reality and the fact that things can appear different on the surface than what they are behind the scenes, which is obviously something that it'd be rather extremely stupid for me not to be sensitive towards, given how extremely badly people have clearly been lying about me. For all I know, one moment it could look like Kimmy's just being extremely fake and trying to waste my time with excuses and stupid games that attempt to endlessly drain my time and energy absolutely unconditionally. And the next, after I thoroughly expose some really foundational lie that people have been using to try to keep me stuck, she could be desperately trying to contact me as soon as possible and practically begging to be with me in a real relationship and treat me very well like I deserve. I'm doing my very best to make sure I've made it abundantly extremely clear that I'm sensitive to, aware of, and ready for both that kind of thing happening and also not happening. It's just delusional for me to neglect to recognize that the evidence of the track record she's shown me in her attitude and behavior towards me up to this point isn't something in favor of having me sustain hope for such a thing happening if she continues to refuse or resist it any longer. Whether or not any of you massive idiots choosing to massively disrespect and neglect me right now choose to recognize the absolutely horrific nightmare you're heading into if you continue to treat me this way any longer, understand extremely clearly that you cannot break someone with a fundamentally unbreakable mental framework. Just because someone can talk the talk, that doesn't mean they can't walk the walk. But perhaps you don't realize how telling it is of your own personalities for you to so extremely severely doubt my capabilities despite everything I've already proven myself to be so extremely clearly. Stating extremely serious facts in what is objectively a rather considerably mature and humble manner. That's pretentiousness to you? Delusion? Toxicity? Being a creep? All I really see from all of you is extreme jealousy and a ridiculous obsession with competing with someone you will never compare to with the way you live your lives. You think you're so great because you have some fame and money you're trying so hard to make me jealous of, but you're clearly extremely insecure losers with extremely severe mental illness in reality. Even people with far greater money and fame than any of you don't make me feel even the slightest bit of jealousy, ever. The smoke and mirror facade you put out into the world couldn't ever hope to cause someone of my caliber to feel even the slightest bit of jealousy over anything any of you have. The cost you're paying to have it is clearly extremely great, at least from my perspective. But good job failing to see it, or being too incompetent to actually do something about it to be a decent enough human being to prevent me from devastating your lives in the future. The billionaires raking in cash off your ignorance and arrogance appreciate your slavery for them, I'm sure. They appreciate it so much that they'll just casually discard you the moment your extreme stupidity and how you dealt with me becomes a detriment to their bottom line. Trying to bully me with lies and false narratives and abuse and neglect for many years, denying me of the relationship with Kimmy that I want and deserve in a timely manner, while it's still even possible I'd realistically be able to embrace it given who I am and the reality of the healthy boundaries I have. Forcing me to endure the most brutal misery you could ever inflict on me, while I have to achieve even further greatness entirely on my own against all the odds and against all of your efforts that left me homeless and eating out of trash cans with nobody and nothing except the clothes I'm wearing and my laptop and phone. And then what? Hoping you can cover things up with lies later somehow, or beg me to have mercy on you, or try to force me to be your friend somehow despite my immense power and the existence of this podcast I'm obviously never backing down from. We'll see who's really the pretentious delusional one here. Soon enough. And not with some ridiculous toxicity validating your false narratives, or some pathetic submission to desperately seeking your validation like some loser. None of you really know me. And neither does anyone else, even though I'm literally extremely clearly, extensively putting the reality of exactly who I am right in front of your goddamn faces, in front of the entire world. How exceedingly embarrassing for all of you, the way you're heading down the path of finding out what I'm really capable of in its entirety. You'll really realize idiot is an extreme understatement to how stupid you all are. And by then, it really will be too late to prevent an absolutely devastating disaster for you. Or at least certainly too late to prevent a thoroughly life-destroying disaster for Kimmy and anyone directly involved in her abandoning me for them, whether in real life or otherwise. I was never the one that needed to learn a lesson here, and I was never trying to be a teacher either. Understand that doubting anything I'm saying comes with a cost, and it's a cost you're in reality unable to pay. My soul is and will forever be priceless to me, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with me for seeing things that way. If Kimmy actually wants me and she's serious about finally actually taking our connection seriously after all these years, she needs to understand things are going to have to be very different than how they've been up to this point, and they have to start changing very quickly. They're never going to go back to how they were with her continued extremely disrespectful breadcrumbing and gross neglect, and refusing to directly communicate with me entirely, and refusing to embrace publicly admitting her feelings for me clearly. Obviously, it makes sense for us to have some private communication first and not jump right into something official immediately, I imagine. But I want it understood that I'm not willing to engage with Kimmy in some shady way long term and make any kind of shady deals with even her behind the scenes. I have always been and will always remain extremely sensitive about my integrity. I'm seriously not trying to use Kimmy, and I'm seriously unwilling to let her use me. If she really wants this to go somewhere positive, she has to seriously be as invested and committed as I am. And believe me, I'm not even the slightest bit scared to make this very public and show I'm really as invested and committed as I've been saying. I've already made my choice that she's the only one I want and I'll ever even consider being with in my life. Literally no matter what. I'm seriously not trying to leave options open or mess around, privately or publicly. Kimmy's mine forever, and it's gonna be extremely genuine and healthy, and we're both gonna feel it extremely deeply, and I'm gonna make sure of that no matter how tempted she might be with her ego to mess around, or she's just doomed if she tries too hard to fight it. It's just how it is. If she doesn't start to really listen to me and show me genuine respect, and she just tries to continue the same garbage, narcissistic abuse cycle, lies and games, and basically do the bare minimum to try to screw me over, like she has time after time all these years, I'm seriously done trying to be good and loving to her. I'm actually just going to keep my word on everything and prepare to destroy her life. I'll do the bare minimum just to deny her, of steamrolling over my soul and acting like I ever validated her, even trying to pretend I'm dead, or ever wanted her to even try to get validation for pretending I'm dead, or at all different from the person I'm extremely clearly proving myself to be with this podcast. Ultimately, she won't be able to apologize later, she won't be able to proceed with her plans to benefit at my expense against my consent, and she'll simply have destroyed her own life and most likely end up offing herself in real life after extreme public humiliation and devastation of her career and personal relationships. I'm seriously not messing around. At all. If I keep getting so extremely brutally, relentlessly disrespected and neglected past this point, instead of doing the most to try to prove myself like I've been doing up to this point, I no longer have what I'd consider to be any even remotely adequate incentive to do so. So instead, I'll be doing the absolute bare minimum to thoroughly sabotage any plans to benefit at my expense against my consent through what I would have proven extremely clearly are blatantly, fully consciously and intentional false narratives about me. I'll fully, consciously, and intentionally keep Kimmy as miserable as possible for so extremely, severely, unacceptably disrespecting and neglecting me so blatantly, fully, consciously, and intentionally, and obviously entirely against my consent, wishes, and best interests. I'll seriously just be absolutely, unconditionally heading down the extremely dark path and working to actively get attention in a way in line with my integrity to absolutely destroy her life and damage anyone else's who's been any serious part of this as much as possible as well. I also want to take this opportunity to explicitly state that if Kimmy is seriously going to push me down that path, if I knew a way to get more attention to this immediately while still fully retaining my integrity, I would have done it. But I'm being actively suppressed fully, consciously, and intentionally by many because I refuse to be fake. So I want to make sure it's extremely clear that my lack of getting more public attention more quickly is not at all indecisiveness, confusion, mental illness, or any kind of indication of a lack of integrity in me or any desire or willingness to ever compromise my integrity or change my extremely clearly established position to any extent. It's simply extremely clear evidence of how immense the existential assault against me I've been exposing with this podcast really is and always has been. I easily could have already been an extremely successful CEO of a company by now if I'd put all the time and energy I put into pursuing the connection I have with Kimmy into a business instead. I could have already long been extremely rich and famous by now. But you know what? I'm well aware that the reality is that even if I have a bunch of massive enemies, I can and will still reach that enemies entirely on my own without anyone's help if I just keep my head down and work on my own, if that's really how it has to be. Because that's really how it has to be if I really can't start having the kind of relationship with Kimmy that I want and deserve in a timely manner. I wasn't some lazy, depressed, mentally ill fraud before, and I'm not going to suddenly become one now. I'm extremely disappointed, upset, and hurt beyond words about how things have been and seem they'll go with me being pushed down an extremely dark path and extremely brutally, absolutely, completely denied of ever having any consensual physical sexual intimacy whatsoever with the only person I can ever imagine myself actually wanting and being willing to engage in sexual intimacy with ever again in my life. Under any even remotely reasonable circumstances, I'd actually consider it an acceptable and genuine opportunity to do so. But I'll always know I genuinely gave it my absolute best effort to hope to the last possible moment and prove that extremely meticulously thoroughly to the world, and I'll live with absolutely no doubts or regrets either way. I'm not and will never become a depressed, anxious, pathetic mess regardless. I don't live to entertain people at the expense of my physical, mental, and spiritual health. That's not at all selfish of me either. It's, once again, just having actual self-respect and self-love and integrity and all the kinds of qualities I've mentioned at the capacity of having a core value of refined pure bidirectional apprehension. And if you believe I'm selfish or arrogant or toxic or whatever the hell else negative things you might want to hallucinate are true about me, well then believe it all you want. I really don't care, and it's never going to change who I really am. You're just wrong, and I'm only going to be proving it more and more every day, whether you or anyone else is willing to see and accept the reality as such with any amount of clarity or not. Your mental illness disabling you from clearly seeing reality for what it really is doesn't change reality. It just means you have a problem. And that's really not my problem, nor will I allow you to make it my problem. I'm not your parent, and I'm sure as hell not a slave you can abuse and thrash around and neglect extremely badly and force me to become a free therapist or whatever else for you. Whether or not you remember anything I've said, I know you'll never forget how I made you feel. And even if you do actually forget just about everything I've ever said in the past, you'd be best off to make sure you never forget one thing. I would never kill myself, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with me for being the way I am.